If you would like to support our channel, please purchase our new revised edition of the Battle of the Anunnaki Pleiadian Gods, now with an added extra 12,000 words and many more images. Please find the link below.
To our esteemed Honorable Paul Hellyer of Canada, we would give you 20 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. And thank you, Steve, for the invitation. My name, as I said, was Paul Hellyer. I'm a former Minister of National Defence for Canada. I served in 3 governments during a total of 23 and a half years as a Member of Parliament. Although as Minister of National Defence, I had sighting reports of UFOs. I was too busy to be concerned about them at the time because I was trying to unify the Army, Navy and Air Force into a single Canadian Defence Force. And that itself was a kind of battle to the finish. So this was not high on my agenda. But about 10 years ago, I started getting interested due to a young man from Ottawa sending me material on the subject. I told him I was too busy to read it, but he had confidence that someday I would. He sent me a copy of Colonel Corso's book, The Day After Roswell. It took me a while to get around to reading it, but I took it for my summer reading in 2005 and was really impressed with what was contained in it. And what I thought to myself is there are huge issues here, huge issues. And the American people and the people of the world have a right to know what's going on because they're part of it. It's not just an isolated thing. And so after confirming the contents of the book with a retired United States Air Force general, I accept the invitation of Victor Vigiani, who's over here somewhere, and his cohort, Mike Bird, to speak to a symposium at the University of Toronto. And I said, UFOs are as real as the airplanes flying overhead. That gave me the dubious distinction of being the first person of cabinet rank in the G8 group of countries to say so unequivocally. Since then, I've learned a lot from many sources, including a number of the fantastic witnesses that we have heard these last 4 days. They were so outstanding, I was just really blown away with them, the amount of information that was available. And I appreciate every single one of them. But because I'm not a ufologist, I'm a politician, there are only a few things that I want to add in that particular realm. First is that about in the 1960s sometime, there was a flotilla of UFOs headed south that crossed into NATO territory in Europe. And the Commander-in-Chief of the Supreme Allied Headquarters in Europe was naturally very shaken. Fortunately, or maybe divine providence, before the panic button was pushed, the flotilla turned around and headed back north. Obviously, they had thought maybe they were Russian and they were very concerned about it. Anyway, an investigation was launched into this whole subject, and a document was prepared which concluded that at least 4 species had been visiting Earth for thousands of years. And this is my own view at this stage as well. So, except for that, there are just a couple of things that we've talked about that I'd like to refer to. And one was that we were referring to them as they until this morning when Linda Moulton Howe, I think she was the first one, actually named 3 different species. I have brought my latest book called Light at the End of the Tunnel, A Survival Plan for the Human Species, as an aide-memoir. And I name 5 different species here. I'm aware of more now. As a matter of fact, I saw a document just a few days ago that mentioned 20. And I think you, Mr. Chairman, were interested in some of the places they might come from. And I have in here Zeta Reticuli, R-E-T-I-C-U-L-I, Reticuli, the Pleiades, Orion, Andromeda, and the Altair star systems. So I don't think we can any more refer to them as they, because they're not an amorphous mass. They are different species and consequently may have different agendas. I don't think we can say that they all have the same agenda any more than we could say that the United States, China, and Russia had the same agenda. Our real interests may be very similar, but as of now, our perceived interests are still quite far apart. One more observation before I begin what I want to say, and that is that we spent quite a bit of time talking about the 66-year-old cadavers. And I was glad to have Linda this morning finally say that there are live ETs on Earth at this present time, and at least 2 of them probably working with the United States government. The other species that I learned about not too long ago was called the tall whites. And this is when Paula Harris broke the story just a few years ago. And through her good offices, I had the chance to talk for about 3 hours with former Airman Charles Hall and listen to this absolutely fascinating story of how he was working with, first of all, he was scared out of his skin, but after that, when he got to know them, how he was working with, and finally they became to trust each other and have a good working relationship with the tall whites at the gunnery range at Indian Springs in Nevada. And these tall whites were living on United States Air Force property and working in cooperation with the United States Air Force and sharing technology with them. He wrote a book, incidentally, called Millennial Hospitality. There are 4 different versions, but Paula says that Millennial Hospitality number 2 is the best. I think that's the one I read, and it's a very interesting read if you want to sort of get inside the problem of what it's like to bump into these people floating across the terrain in the desert. Well, enough on that for now. My interest is in full disclosure. And my only caveat is I think probably I would say 95 to 98% full disclosure. I know of 1 or 2 things that I'm not sure should be in the public domain, at least yet. They will be someday, I'm sure, but not maybe immediately. But just as children survive the idea of the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus when they become adult, I think that tax-paying citizens are quite capable of accepting the new and broader reality that we live in a cosmos teeming with life of various sorts. The fact that some other civilizations are more advanced than we are may be humbling, but that could be a necessary step in our survival. The world is an unholy mess. We have at best until the end of this decade. In my book, I said we have 10 years to stop global warming if we don't want it to be beyond the point of no return. 2 years has gone past since it was written, so I say we have until the end of the decade to arrest global warming. Yet our leaders don't even talk about it very much except in a superficial way. They appear to be more interested in starting wars to control more oil and, in effect, prolong the gravity of the threat. Of course, even if they took the problem seriously, they wouldn't have the finances to finance the transition from oil to the clean economy, to clean energy, because we have an infinitely silly banking and financial system in the Western world. And the United States Congress, I regret to say, is partly responsible, and I'd be glad to elaborate on that later if you're interested. And finally, they need the technology for clean energy. And it exists, and it's being kept secret by the same vested interests who control our destiny. Who are these vested interests, and what are they up to? Well, Senator, you were talking about a military junta. In my opinion, that is true, but I have broadened and deepened the definition to cabal, and the cabal comprises members of the Three Sisters: the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderbergers, and the Trilateral Commission, the International Banking Cartel, the Oil Cartel, members of various intelligence organizations, and select members of the military junta, who together have become a shadow government of not only the United States, but of much of the Western world. The Council on Foreign Relations is the oldest of the Three Sisters, and as early as October 1940, years before Germany surrendered to the Allied armies and to vaporize Hitler's vision of empire, the Council's Economic and Financial Group drafted a memorandum outlining a comprehensive policy, quote, to set forth the political, military, territorial, and economic requirements of the United States in its political potential leadership of the non-German world, including the United Kingdom itself, as well as the Western Hemisphere and the Far East. The Council made absolutely no effort to disguise, where's that? Right next page, yeah. The Council made no effort to disguise the fact that the purpose of the Grand Area and later world hegemony was to support an expanding U.S. economy, to provide it with raw materials and markets for its products. This was labeled the national interest, quote unquote. It was equally clear that the national interest was the interest of the ruling elite, whose members comprised the Council. The real interests of the majority of rank-and-file Americans was never a factor in the equation. So, Mr. David Rockefeller, who was a member of all three of the sisters, is quoted as saying this at a meeting of the Bilderbergers in Europe. We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the lights of publicity during those years. But the world is more sophisticated and prepared to march toward a world government. The supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practiced in past centuries. He, of course, pretended he didn't say that, but the witness, this is reported by Daniel Estulin, a thoroughly reliable reporter who has written the true story of the Bilderberger Group. And if you want to really get inside of what's been going on there for this long time, that's a good place to go. So anyway, you hear what Mr. Rockefeller said, and so there you have it. The aim of the game is a world government comprising members of the cabal who are elected by no one, and accountable to no one. And according to Mr. Rockefeller, the plan is well advanced. Does this help you to understand why our civil rights are being taken away from us? I say us, because Canada too is included in the grand plan. A giant leap in the wrong direction followed the end of the Cold War. No one could have been happier than I was when the Berlin Wall came down on November the 9th, 1989. The elation on our side of the curtain was near universal, and very significant on the other side as one country after another regained its freedom. Nearly everyone believed that it was the dawn of a new era of peace and prosperity for people everywhere. There was much talk of a peace dividend. The prospects were dazzling in their scope and diversity. It was a unique and God-given opportunity for a new, braver, and fairer world. We blew it. We blew the chance of a lifetime to do good things. A small group of zealots undermined our golden opportunity to pursue peace, not war, and little did we dream that they had a vastly different vision of the new world order. Their plan, which is now commonly known as the Project for a New American Century, included preventive wars in clear violation of international law, regime change wherever and whenever the U.S. desires, and if they can get away with it without excessive casualties, and the establishment of a kind of economic and cultural hegemony with America acting as constabulary, quote unquote. That was their word, globally. This was to be accomplished without authority of the United Nations and without the restraint of existing international treaties. It would involve a military build-up unprecedented in peacetime history and could trigger an arms race, which is precisely the opposite of the peace dividend that the world had rightly looked forward to. The Machiavellian scheme involved secret police, the curtailment of civil liberties in defiance of the U.S. Constitution, and a moribund economy operating way below its potential. Exactly those features for which the Soviet Union was held in contempt. The initial draft of the document was so controversial when it was leaked to the New York Times that it had to be rewritten, but it was not changed very much, just the cosmetics, enough to make it politically acceptable. So I have a few minutes here to my bearings. The document said this: well, it may have been easy to persuade President Bush to abandon his stated policy of not getting America more deeply involved in international affairs, but persuading the American people would be more difficult. Sophisticated Americans would question such a giant sea change in policy. The authors of Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century recognized this difficulty from the outset, because their document contained the following sentence: further, I'm quoting, further, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary changes, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. Well, it wasn't too long before they got their catastrophic and catalyzing event. Terrorists struck the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington on September the 11th, 2011. Incidentally, they have removed the sentence about Pearl Harbor in the document that you can now get if you went to the internet to find it. Almost the whole world mourned. Canada mourned. The overwhelming majority of Muslims condemned the treacherous attacks. My sympathy for the friends and families of the injured and dead was genuine and unwavering to this day. My sympathy for the U.S. government began to grow a bit thin, however, when I heard President Bush cite the reasons for the attack. And I quote, "Why do they hate us?" he asked rhetorically in an address to the Congress. "They hate what they see right here in this chamber, democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other." I felt sad when I heard the President's word. I assumed that he believed what he was saying. But if that were true, he was profoundly ignorant of the real thoughts and feelings of people in other parts of the world. If he wanted to hear the truth, he should have listened to Osama bin Laden, who was well informed concerning the origins of the kind of fanatical hatred of the United States which has led to such treachery. This is his version of events. Every Muslim must rise to defend his religion. The wind of faith is blowing, and the wind of change is blowing to remove evil from the peninsula of Muhammad. Peace be upon him. As to America, I say to you and its people a few words. I swear to God that America will not live in peace before peace reigns in Palestine and before all the army of infidels depart the land of Muhammad. Peace be upon him. That is clear enough. The dislike of America has nothing to do with democracy versus dictatorship, or wealth, or freedom of religion, or freedom of assembly. It is directly related to American foot-dragging and stick-handling a just settlement of the Palestinian question.
Mr. Hellyer, I hate to interrupt. Time has expired, but I'm very happy if the panel has no objection to allow another minute or two to finish your statement. How much time do you think you need to finish it?
I think probably somewhere between 1 and 5 minutes, most.
I think we'll give you 2 minutes to finish your statement, as much as I'd like to grant more. Thank you.
Okay. In short, American foreign policy was the root of the conflict. So here we are more than a decade later fighting another war that can't be won. There is no country on earth powerful enough to protect its citizens against fanatical hate, as we learned from the Boston Marathon. And the mere attempt to pursue the impossible pits neighbor against neighbor and the state power structure against everyone. All of the freedoms won by the millions of men and women who fought and died in World War II are being flushed unceremoniously down the drain. The only hope of peace is a negotiated settlement. This will require a paradigm shift in American attitudes. It involves a de facto renunciation of the plan for a new American energy and the adoption of a pledge of cooperation with all humankind to build the kind of world which we are collectively capable of. Young people everywhere need to be challenged by a noble cause. They need to be involved in arresting global warming, creating a banking system that is just and sustainable, and lead the way in the transformation to the new reality that we have to live in harmony with our celestial neighbors, as well as seeking peace on earth. In a word, we have to become spiritual beings and practice the one tenet that the world's major religions have in common, and that is the Golden Rule. In this field, too, and I just want to read one paragraph at this time, if you'll allow me, Mr. Chair.
Well, we will allow that, but there's only about 30 seconds, so I hope you can conclude it with that statement.
Fast.
Thank you.
This is from the late Dr. John Mack, an American secular Jewish psychiatrist who became a world leader in interviewing abductees, or experiencers, as he called them, came to this conclusion in a startling book, Passport to the Cosmos. Quote, although the aliens are not themselves gods, their behavior is sometimes anything but godlike. Abductees consistently report that the beings seem closer to the Godhead than we are, acting as messengers, guardian spirits, or angels, intermediaries between us and the divine source. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
What is this place? Who are these guys?
Ancient aliens? Anunnakis?
You better get over here, Doctor. You have to see these. What are those things?
This is extraterrestrial technology.
What is this place? It doesn't look like a library.
Water and darkness obscured the fiery eyes of the evil beings, and their bodies remained captive in the chambers sealed by sacred glyphs. As centuries went by, the great Mayan civilization and its inhabitants mysteriously disappeared, abandoning their cities, leaving a prophecy that describes an ark, the Pizon Gagal, containing a manuscript that holds the reptilian prophecy, warning future civilizations of the return of the black star of evil, Oowk, back into our solar system, in search of its 9 ambassadors and its warriors of evil. The Xibalba prisoners have escaped thanks to our ignorance and ambition. The ancestral reptilian leaders are now free, and the arrival of Oowk is imminent. But none of this was a mistake. Nothing has happened by accident. He discovered the beings that have been behind all human suffering. Now I know that his search was guided by a higher power. Now I know that my colleagues and friends didn't die in vain. Their lives were lost to free humanity from fear and slavery. In a parallel dimension, there, they rescued me. They awoke me with a great wisdom. They prepared me to awaken others. Now I know I have a purpose. I know that there is a liberation plan. I know I've survived to expose them and expel them out of our beloved planet. Now I know we are not alone in the battle. We have never been. The signs are everywhere. Help has arrived.
And by the time 1968 rolled around, I was a sophomore in college, I'd been initiated a first-degree witch. In 1972, I was ordained a spiritualist minister and a medium. I was trained as a medium with the Alliance of Divine Love. I became a Druidic high priest in 1973, July. I became a Wiccan high priest in September of that same year. In 1974, August, we moved to Milwaukee to start a network of covens there. In 1975, in Milwaukee, I began studying Masonry. I was made an entered apprentice that year in Heartland Lodge number 122. In 1975, I read the Satanic Bible for the first time and ended up joining the Church of Satan. In 1976, I was ordained to the Old Roman Catholic priesthood, because you can't be a Satanic priest until first you're a Catholic priest. In 1976 November, I was raised to the sublime degree of a Master Mason, although there's really nothing sublime about it. But I became a warlock in the Church of Satan in April of '77. I was made a bishop in the Gnostic Catholic Church, which is a Crowleyan version of the Orthodox Church, in July of that year. In 1977 September, I was created a 90th degree Mason in the Rite of Memphis Mitzrayim. I was also brought into voodoo that year. And finally, my last step before getting born again, in August of 1980, I was baptized a Mormon. And that same year, I was also made a Shrine Noble, a 32nd degree Mason, and I got a master's degree in theology from a Catholic seminary. You think I was a little confused spiritually? So let's see, at the same time I was a Mormon, I was getting a Catholic theology degree, I was a Shriner, and supposedly you can't be a Catholic and a Mason at the same time. And I was also practicing voodoo, and one thing I didn't mention, I was also a practicing vampire. So pretty bizarre stuff. Important thing, what did all these apparently different organizations have in common? Well, as we shall see, the commonality in all things was that they all have something to do with UFOs. Now that might surprise you, but you're going to see how all this comes together in a really very sinister little web. When you look at the various classic alien races that are supposedly out there in ufology, you have the Nordics, you have the Reptilians, and you have the Greys. Those are the main classifications. There are also sub-classifications. What I believe is that when you see a Nordic, I hope you don't, but if you do, you're looking at a fallen angel in a more pristine condition. Because obviously angels are beautiful beings in their original state. The problem is that if you're a fallen angel, you've just cut yourself off from the one source of beauty, of creativity, of love, and of power. So what happens? You start resembling your new father, the worm, the dragon, the serpent. And so gradually, fallen angels start degenerating. Like I say, they're gone to seed, and they end up looking reptilian. They end up looking like these, draconian or reptilian, or whatever you want to call them, forms of aliens. They're still very dangerous, and they're still very powerful. And I believe, and I mean, again, there's different opinions on this, they can briefly shapeshift and appear to be human, but that their natural state is like this. In terms of the Greys, who are, of course, the real famous aliens, you see these things all over town here, I think the Greys are essentially genetic experimentation of the fallen angels that didn't work out very well. So therefore they're functioning kind of like drones. They're like the workers. I don't think they're very smart. In my experience, they're kind of almost robot-like in what they do. So I think behind all of this are very high-level angelic powers, because a lot of people, they think, well, okay, fallen angels, that's fine, but we forget about what Paul tells us in Ephesians 6:12. He talks about principalities and powers. Again, the word archon has been already mentioned, which is the Greek that's used in here. Rulers of the darkness, spiritual wickedness in high places. But these are beings that, again, a whole other order of magnitude above fallen angels. These are the Elohim, the gods, if you will, plural, members of the divine council. I take it for granted as an operating premise that some fallen angels, or of whatever variety, are at the pinnacle of all false religious systems, promoting deception to keep people away from true salvation. So, for example, there's a principality that's over Freemasonry. There's a principality that's over Mormonism. There's a principality that is over different, UFO-type groups. He said there are beings of intelligence and power far beyond, of a far higher quality than anything we conceive of as human. They are not necessarily based on the cerebral and nervous structures that we know, and that the one and only chance for mankind to advance as a whole is for individuals to make contact with such beings. So this is the guy who boasted that he was the evilest man of the 20th century. Then he found the Golden Dawn, which was the consummate occult society of 19th century England. The deities that are talked about in this book are called Nuit, Hadit, and Rehur Kuit. And Nuit is a star goddess, Hadit is like her consort, and Rehur Kuit is the hawk-headed god of war. He's often known as Horus, if you're familiar with Egyptian mythology. You can't understand the impact Lovecraft has had in our popular culture. Dozens of books and stories have been inspired by Lovecraft. Movies. I don't know if you ever heard of this H.R. Giger, or Giger, I'm not sure how he says his name. He's actually a member of the Swiss OTO, which is a Crowleyan cult. He's a very, very bizarre artist, and he's the one who designed the original Alien for the movie Alien. And he said he got his inspiration for his art by meditating on the works of H.P. Lovecraft. The Mormons have been mentioned a couple times, and I don't want to let anything I'm saying here be taken as that I'm attacking Mormons. Most Mormons are wonderful people. But a lot of them, if you know them, are obsessed with UFOs. If you look at the original story of how Mormonism started, Joseph Smith claims that he went off to pray into this grove that now Mormons call the Sacred Grove in upstate New York, near Palmyra. And he claims, now listen to this, not with the eyes of faith, but with the eyes of a UFO person, someone who's into UFOs. He claims that as he was kneeling and praying and asking God for wisdom of what church to join, all of a sudden this column of light came down from the heavens, and he felt enveloped by darkness. He felt like he had no energy, like he couldn't even cry out, and he felt as if he was almost going to suffocate in darkness. And then all of a sudden, from out of this light, two beings appeared, glowing in white. And they looked identical, and one being said to the other, "This is my beloved son, hear him." And the other being told Joseph Smith not to join any church, but rather to wait for further instructions. I'm paraphrasing here. Now, you could say, well, that was a heavenly vision. Or you could say, were those two UFO nauts? It's interesting. For example, how many of you realize that Mormons teach that the God of Mormonism, Heavenly Father, is actually an extraterrestrial being? He's a man just like you and me with body parts and passions. That's their terminology. From the planet Kolob, at the heart of the galaxy. In fact, how many of you realize that the guy that created the science fiction show Battlestar Galactica back in the 70s was a Mormon, Glenn Larson. And he incorporated a lot of Mormon ideas into that science fiction show. In this temple, these people, nice Mormon people, were seeing lizards 6 feet tall running down the corridors of the temple. It was like the demons were not able to deceive. They were being seen for what they really were, whether they were fallen angels or whatever, I don't know what they were, but we had many women, especially women have more sense about these things than men do, amen? And they just said, I want out of this church, I don't care what I got to do. And they came, and we got more than a dozen different women coming and saying that they were seeing like these 6 foot tall giant lizards running through the halls of the Seattle temple. So make that, and then the funny other thing is that there's been numerous reports. We have at least 2 people that have said when they were underneath the Mormon temple, because there's like 5 or 6 levels beneath the Salt Lake Temple. And believe it or not, they would see reptilian beings under there.
Proceeded to tell me what to do. If we're out on the road, we see a UFO, we do not go to the launcher, but instead to the nearest launch control facility. Also, we call job control and let them know what we're doing. If we're at a site and we're penetrating, then we have to stop what we're doing, remove ourselves from the site, call job control. We all have radio controls, radio contact with all these. It's called a job control, and wait for further instructions. Now, if we're at the site and we're doing our work, I have to take myself, my team, and the targeting tapes, go into the launcher, close the personnel hatch. Now, all the teams, before you go out into the field, will take with us an armed guard. That's just normal. We have to leave the one guard, armed guard, on top, all by himself, and he's supposed to report to job control or the launch control facility or what he was seeing. And then I says, okay, but then he says one other thing, don't leave yet. We're going to hold everybody back until we're sure that all the activity out in the field has ceased, at least for the time being. So I waited around about an hour and a half. He was all ready to go. Then they contacted me and says, okay, you can go now. So I went with my team. We went out to the field. We restarted. We had to go to Oscar Flight. That's not a very pleasant thing. Oscar Flight is 120 miles. It's the furthest flight from the base. And in Air Force trucks, that's not the most comfortable ride. But nevertheless, we went out to Oscar Flight, and we restarted, I think it's either 3 or 4 missiles. This is where Bob was at the time. We restarted 3 or 4 of their missiles. The startups were successful, and I saw no incidents in the field. When I came back, we have to go through debriefing. The first things I asked them upon return to the base, what about this missile out in Belt? Where he said as soon as daylight came, he was going to send choppers over. it was nighttime when they first saw it, and no one's going to have them scale down the mountain at nighttime. So they were going to send some choppers down and scale the mountain, scale the canyon daylight time. But as soon as daylight time came up, this thing shot up right through everything and just disappeared, more or less. So that was that. Now, also, about a week later, I also heard that a UFO was sighted over India flight, and there was a partial shutdown. I think 4 or 5 missiles was shut down at India flight with a UFO overhead, not the whole flight. And I had to go out and restart at least 2 of them. And then the rest of my time at Montana, I was involved in no more further UFO incidents. Nothing else happened. And then I went on elsewhere. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Charles I. Halt. I retired from the U.S. Air Force in 1991 as a colonel. During my military career, I was base commander of 2 large installations, and at the time of my retirement, I was in the Department of Defense Inspector General's office with total inspection oversight of all services and all service agencies. In 1980, I was reassigned from the Pentagon to RAF Bentwaters as a deputy base commander. At that time, Bentwaters was one of the largest tactical fighter wings in the world. We had the 2 base complex, Woodbridge and Bentwaters in England, and 4 FOLs in Germany, and 2 additional standby bases. In December 1980, early in the morning, several of our security policemen discovered strange lights in the forest in East Anglia, just outside the back gate of RAF Woodbridge. 3 patrolmen, Sergeant Peniston, Airman Burroughs, and Airman Cabanasac, actually were dispatched into the forest and approached a craft. They reported it being triangular, approximately 3 meters on a side, dark metallic in appearance with strange markings. They observed it for a period of time, and it very quickly and silently vanished at high speed. Initially, I was not aware of all the details. I was only told of strange lights, and I was sure there was a logical explanation. 2 nights later at the family Christmas party, we were interrupted. The on-duty flight commander for the security police squadron, Lieutenant Bruce England, came and approached the base commander and I. He was white as a sheet. He said, "It's back." We said, "What's back?" He said, "The UFO." Well, we still were, I should say, non-believers at that point. Since my boss had to do the presentations, I was tasked, unfortunately, to investigate. So I went home and changed clothes. I really expected to find a logical explanation. I took several security policemen with me, a disaster preparedness NCO who took an APN-27, a Geiger counter, and a camera. I also had my small cassette recorder I carried everywhere when I was on duty. I was taken to the supposed site. We found indentations approximately 1.5 inches deep, approximately 6 to 8 feet on a side, and radiation of 8 to 9 times normal background radiation. Not enough to be dangerous to somebody, but significant. We also found broken branches on the trees. While we were milling around trying to make sense of the whole thing, one of the individuals with me suddenly spotted something. Off through the forest was a bright, glowing object. The best way I can describe it, it looked like an eye. It was bright red with a dark center. It appeared to be winking. It would sort of wink. It was shedding something like molten metal. It was dripping off it. It silently moved through the trees, avoiding any contact. It bobbed up and down, and at one point it actually approached us. We tried to get closer. It receded out into the field, beyond the forest, and silently exploded into 5 white objects. Gone. So we went out into the field looking for any evidence, because something had apparently been falling off it, and we found nothing. But while we were searching around in the field, one of the people with me noticed some objects in the sky to the north. There were 3 or 4 objects in the north, brightly colored, changing from elliptical to round, and moving at very high speed and sharp angular movements as though they were doing a grid search. While we were watching them, somebody else noticed to the south there were 2 objects just sort of hovering in the sky. One object approached us at very high speed, best guess is 3,000 to 5,000 feet, somewhere in that neighborhood, stopped directly overhead and sent down a concentrated beam at our feet. It was about 1 foot in diameter. The best way I can equate it is sort of a laser beam. We stood there in awe. Was this a warning? Was this an attempt to communicate? Was this a weapon or just a probe? Just as suddenly as it appeared, click, it disappeared. We stood there, really concerned. About that time, we noticed the other object to the south was sending down beams, about a mile, mile and a half away over Woodbridge Base. We had 3 different radios with us, the police radio, the security police radio, and I had the command net. All 3 radios were functional and we were talking to control centers. They were constantly breaking up and we had great difficulties communicating, but we were able to discern that on the police and security net that some of those beams were either falling into or near the weapons storage area, and there's a great deal of concern. It really bothered me at the time. Every time something of significance happened that night, I kind of clicked on my little tape recorder and recorded it so I'd have a record of it for the next day. Unbeknownst to me, a copy of that was released by one of my co-workers several years later, and hence there was a lot of publicity. My superiors at the time were informed what happened. I briefed my boss. I played the tape for him. He listened intently. He was aware of the incident because he was monitoring the night before on the radio. He and several others were. He took the tape to the 3rd Air Force staff meeting the following Wednesday. 3rd Air Force was the Air Force headquarters at that time in England. Played it for General Baisley, the commander and staff. They all sat silently. The decision was, it happened off the base, so it's a British affair. In other words, they were loath to get involved. So my boss came back and threw me the tape recorder, and I said, well, what do we do, boss? He said, get with Squadron Leader Moreland, who was the British liaison officer, and do a report. It's their problem, not ours. Gosh, here I am kind of caught in the middle, and I'm a junior guy here. Whoa, why did I ever get involved? Well, Squadron Leader Moreland was on vacation in Wales at the time. He came back and he was quite upset that he was in the middle of the thing too. So he said, well, write a memo. So I wrote I shall call it a cleaned up memo, just kind of unexplained lights, just to kind of get them to come out and investigate and look into the thing. Well, I gave it to Moreland, and unbeknownst to me, Moreland sent a copy to his superior, 3rd Air Force. I didn't know that at the time. The copy to MOD was apparently buried in the files. Days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, and I almost forgot about the incident, to be honest with you. Gave up. Several years later, one of my co-workers was playing a copy of my tape at cocktail parties and caught somebody's ear. Somebody started asking questions, and he said, oh, Holt wrote a memo. The next thing we know, there was a Freedom of Information request came into Bentwaters. Of course, there was no official copy. We didn't have word processors in those days. We used typing manifolds in the old typewriters. We were just transitioning. And the only copy was an onion skin that I had in my desk. So my boss went back and said, there's no official record of it. Well, somebody else found out the 3rd Air Force had a copy. Well, Pete Bent, a good personal friend of mine, was the acting 3rd Air Force commander, called me and he said, hey, Chuck, I've got a copy of this memo. We're going to have to release it. I said, please, burn it. Your life and mine will never be the same. You and I don't need this. Well, need I say more? The tape came out, unbeknownst to me. The memo came out, and a lot of publicity. But the event certainly happened. Now, some things have happened since then. I was very innocent at the time and believed what I was told. I asked the OSI if they had an interest, and I was told, oh, no, not at all. Wrong. I found out later that the airmen were, how shall I say, pretty harshly interrogated that were involved. I have never been debriefed. I also found out later that the tower operator, both the tower operators at Bentwaters saw an object and picked it up on their Bright 2 radar and watched it. I found out that the tower operator in the weapons storage area actually saw something, as did a comm man who was working there, and saw it go down into the forest near us. And also several other people around the base saw it. It's kind of interesting. What did we see? I have no idea what we saw that night. I do know it was under intelligent control, and in my personal opinion, it was either from another dimension or extraterrestrial.
Good afternoon. My name is Jerome Nelson. From 1962 to 1965, I was an Atlas F ICBM Deputy Missile Combat Crew Commander, assigned to the 579th Strategic Missile Squadron in Roswell, New Mexico. Sometime during the winter of 1963 through 1964, while I was on alert duty in the Launch Control Center at Atlas Site 9 west of Roswell, my topside security guard called me on the telephone and reported a bright light that is a fully illuminated round object was hovering silently over the missile silo and shining a light down onto it. I could tell that he was serious, and his voice revealed he was very frightened. After perhaps 5 minutes, the object left the vicinity. Even before it left, I called the base command post at Walker Air Force Base and reported the incident. I was concerned the object would somehow sabotage the missile. I was surprised by the response I received, being told that the command post would take on the unauthorized excursion under advisement. I was never debriefed by my commander or anyone else, which I found quite puzzling and frustrating. Over the next month or so, this type of incident occurred several more times while I was on duty at Site 9. I would estimate the total number as more than 3, but fewer than 10. On each occasion, I would call the command post, but each time my report was met with the same apparent indifference. During each of these incidents I witnessed, the guard would call the Launch Control Center and report the UFO. Several guards were involved over time and were all obviously frightened by the object hovering over the site. Their voices were actually trembling. Because of my duties in the Launch Control Center, I could not go topside and look at the objects myself. Only decades later did I learn that at least one missile facility technician, Bob Kaplan, had been ordered to report to the Office of Special Investigations on base and make a report about the similar incident he had witnessed at Site 9 during the period. At the time this development was kept from me and my missile commander. I do not know whether anyone else was interviewed by the OSI, but I wasn't. That's my report.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Patrick McDonough, and I'm here today to relate an experience that happened to me in September of 1966. That's 44 years ago. But that experience was so significant, it was basically burned in my memory. I haven't forgotten about it at all. But I am getting older, and I did want to put this experience and relate it on the record. A little background on me: I had enlisted in the Air Force in Berkeley, California in first week of November 1962. At the onset of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was going. I felt patriotic. And up to that time, I had been studying engineering in college. I had 3 years of engineering. And the Air Force, considering my background, trained me to be a geodetic surveyor. And I was assigned to 1381st Geodetic Survey Squadron in Orlando, Florida. We basically, in 1965, we moved to Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. On average, I would spend 9-10 months a year on temporary duty, surveying for latitude and longitude at our missile sites and aircraft bases for positioning missile and aircraft guidance systems. Basically, the squadron's mission was to provide precise geographical coordinates for a missile or an aircraft inertial guidance system, so that the missile or aircraft would know exactly precisely where it was at when it takes off, while the intelligence agencies would provide the targeting information. In early September of 1966, myself and 2 other airmen, a Airman First Class Al Kramer and a Airman Third Class Charlie Coates, we were temporarily assigned to Malmstrom Air Force Base, and were ordered to provide or perform the initial geodetic surveys for the last 50 missile sites there. There already was 150 Minuteman I sites, and we were putting in the last 50 for the wing. And basically, we were assigned to the Site Activation Task Force they call SATAF. It was a Boeing, really, the prime contractor. We were given a government truck, no radio, anything in it. I was the chief of party. I was the observer on our small three-man team. Al was the recorder. Charlie was, we were trying to train him both in observing and recording. We normally would arrive at a missile site at about in early evening. We'd set up our instruments, and basically what I was doing was the star observation to provide precise latitude and longitude. On the night of this incident that happened, we were completing a series of what we call celestial astro-azimuth observations southeast of Conrad. And I was doing the observing, Al was recording, and Charlie was assisting Al with the chronometer on the time hacks as I tipped on Polaris. The unusual thing about this missile site I was at was that the blast hatch of the silo was open. And that was very unusual. Normally when I'd go to these missile sites, even though they were not activated yet with a missile, they were always closed. The monoliths were there. We do 4 monoliths and do a precise quadrangle. And the work we did was very precise. It involved a lot of, it was basically all using star shots. And so here's a site that we arrive at, and the blast hatch is open. And we're nearing completion of the star observations. We had been to the other 3 monoliths, and I was at the monolith at the next to the hatch. And it was probably about 1:30, and a unidentified flying object came from the north and stopped right over us. I would say it was probably about altitude of 300 feet or so, maybe a little higher. It's a little hard to tell in the dark. It was round. It had, I would estimate its diameter at about 50 feet, kind of like a pretty large, you know, like a wingspan of a B-52, something in that range. It's pretty large. It seemed to have pulsating lights going around it, and it had a white light from the center looking down into the silo. There was no wind, there was no noise. Still only stayed there maybe 20, 30 seconds at most. And then I just remember, I'm staring up at the stars, right? I'm a pretty keen observer of what's above me here in the celestial sphere up there. And I just said to myself, what if this thing beams us up and takes us off to some distant place and never returned to Earth again? I mean, this is going through my head here while this thing's above me. And then from this dead stop, it shoots off to the east, just like now you see it, now you don't. It just, phew. So after this UFO departs, I grabbed my instrument and jumped in the truck behind the steering wheel, and off we went. And we weren't about to be there if it came back. We didn't have guards with us because there was no missile. We didn't have a radio because we're not really in contact with the Air Force Base. I don't know any of this other stuff is even going on, to be honest with you. I mean, we're just kind of out there on our own doing these sites and mailing our material back. It was wasn't even aware there was a UFO problem per se. But as it turned out, the night's events weren't totally over with us at that point. As we sped away and on our way back to Conrad, and Army Corps of Engineers had base rocked all the roads to take the weight of these missiles they were bringing in. And of course these are new sites, and they took down all the signs to make the roads wider. And I go over the hill and come down, the headlights come down, there's no road there at Teed, you know. And so I tried to make you either went to the right or left. I tried to go to the left to towards Conrad, and the truck flipped over, and we ended up upside down. Fortunately, none of us were hurt. We walked probably about 2 hours to a nearby farmhouse, if you call that nearby, and called the Montana Highway Patrol. The farmer drove us back to the accident site, and it was interesting when the highway patrolman arrived, because we told him, you know, how did this occur? He was asking us, and I told him that his dispatch had told him there had been over 20 reports to his office that night in reporting a UFO in the area. I wrote incident reports to the SATAF, Boeing, Montana's state regarding the accident. But, you know, what was interesting was I never heard anything from the Air Force regarding the incident, and I never had to, there was no retribution or reimbursement required from me for rolling this truck. And this truck had 18 miles on it that afternoon. It was a new truck. Okay, so nothing, I heard nothing. So this part was good because I didn't really want to buy the truck. I went back to my headquarters at Warren Air Force Base, and about a month and a half later I was discharged. I did not mention wrecking this truck up in Montana on one of my TDYs. They didn't ask me, and I didn't mention it. I didn't want to buy it. But I must say now, in my 4 years that I had with this Geodetic Survey Squadron, I had worked on the latest missiles and aircraft in the U.S. Air Force inventory. And I worked everywhere on these guidance systems. And I never saw anything in the Air Force inventory that could perform like this UFO did. I don't know what it was, but we sure didn't have any. I never saw anything like it. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here today, and thank the National Press Club. Hopefully someday we'll know in the near future that the government will perhaps release any information they have on UFOs. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. I'm Bruce Fenstermacher. I don't have any exciting stories like rolling a truck with 18 miles on it. From 1974 to 1976, I was a combat crew commander and a captain in the Air Force, stationed at F.E. Warren Air Force Base at the 400th SMS and assigned to Romeo flight. In the fall of 76, my deputy, who I'll call Sam because he's not given me permission to release his name, we were on alert, trying to stay awake. We were listening to the conversation between the flight security controller of the topside NCO and the strategic alert team, the security alert team, the SATs. Kind of that was one way to stay alert, because the SAC duty is moments of terror with hours of boredom. And suddenly we heard the FSC call the SAT team and say, stop the vehicle. Get out of the vehicle and look around. I didn't tell them where to look or anything. And Sam and I looked at each other and then said, what do you see? And he said, oh, I don't see anything. I don't see anything. Holy bleep. I do see a white pulsating light in the sky. It's maybe 7 or 8 miles away. The FSC asked where it was. He said it's to the north. He said it's pretty close to where the launch control facility is. So my deputy and I did a double take. We called upstairs, And we said, what's going on? He said, you're not going to believe this, Captain, but right above us, there's a huge white thing, pulsating light above us, and I had to call them to make sure I wasn't seeing anything. Upon prodding, he told us it was shaped like a fat cigar. I think he said a pregnant cigar. White pulsating light. Between the pulsations, he saw red and blue lights. It was silent, because I prodded him saying, is it some sort of helicopter? He said, no, it's very silent. We're talking to him for several minutes, and he says it's starting to move away along our access road. So we hung up. My deputy and I are saying, what do? We got to report this. He calls down, the FSC calls down shortly and says it's over one of our launch facilities, the missile silos, and it was the closest one along the access road. So I ordered the SAT team to go to that site. And they called in through the FSC, so they had to go back for batteries. And they were a little slow getting out, so I was kind of ordering them, come on, get on, get going. And at the same time, we contacted SAC command post at FE Warren. And the NCO answered, and we told him the story, and he laughed and said, when it eats the SAT team, call me back. So the SAT team never got to that LF. It silently moved again to another launch facility. We called the SAT team 3 or 4 times. I'm sorry, we called command post 3 or 4 times. The last time, and we got the same nonchalant attitude. The last time I said, are you logging this? And they said no. So I said, give me the officer in charge. And he said, well, he's busy. I said, well, either give me the officer in charge or I'm going to wake up the base commander, the squadron commander, because there's something going on, something's messing with my LFs. They were mine for that period. So the officer came on, and I said, you need to log this or I'll wake everybody up. He said he would. He called us, his NCO, a different NCO called us back a few minutes later, took the log of what had happened in a timely sequence. So it went to another LF. The SAT team had to come back for gas. Then it said it had car trouble. It could only go 5 miles an hour. So long story short, after several, about an hour and a half, the flight security controller said he could see it over another launch facility still down the road. And then he said it suddenly and silently just went away up to a star size and then disappeared. So that was it. It was an exciting rest of the tour. The next day we were relieved by another crew to go back home. And I went upstairs, and the FSC is lying like in a chair in almost a fetal position. And I talked to him, and he was scared. He said, I can't sleep. I can't get that thing out of my mind. And I said, what the heck was with the SAT team? He said, both my deputy and I were prior service, so we got along well with the enlisted guys. So I said, if you promise not to tell anybody, they told me they were not going to go to any LF with that thing over it. No direct orders, no nothing, and in fact, they never left the launch control facility. We picked up the Quebec team on the way back, the Quebec crew, because Quebec was on the way to Romeo, and SAC liked to save a little gas, so we road share. And they told us that earlier that evening, they had the same sort of thing flying over several of their launch facilities. And I said, what happened? You reported it. And they said, are you crazy? We didn't report it. We're not going to report it. I said, well, I did. He said, well, if you tell them about us, we're going to say it never happened. So we went back home. I reported to my squadron commander. The next few, we always have departure meetings when you go out for alert. The next several departure meetings, we had an unusual visitor. We had an officer in a uniform telling us that you may have heard rumors about this. It didn't happen. It's top secret. And I wanted to stand up and say, which is it? Didn't it happen, or is it top secret? So that's my event. I think Mr. Salas could back.
Thank you.
What you have heard here today is evidence of a phenomenon. It sounds fantastic, and it is fantastic. We presented this evidence in the public interest of open government. Our signatures on affidavits in the press kit that you have attest to the truth of our statements. Our evidence is now public domain. The real question is, what is the public going to do with it, this testimony? It has been a general practice of the media to scoff at these kinds of stories, make light of such testimony. We can only ask that you take the time to give some serious consideration not only to our statements, but to the statements of other witnesses out there who have similar incidents. There is also documentary evidence that helps support what we have said. We hope you will take the time to at least take a look at those, research this a little bit, and if you do, I think you'll come to the same conclusions that we have. That is that the UFO phenomenon is real, not imaginary. There's current excessive secrecy in our government surrounding this phenomenon. Unknown aerial objects have in fact been observed over many of our nuclear weapons bases and other nuclear facilities, and in some cases the appearance of these objects coincided with compromising the operational readiness of our nuclear weapons. Although each of us might have different opinions about the meaning and intent of these incidents, I think we can all agree that the tampering with nuclear weapons is a national security concern. This is Air Force official policy on UFOs. This is dated 2005, but I believe it is current policy. I'll just read one part of it. It says, no UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force was ever an indication of threat to our national security. That is clearly misleading. It is false based on our testimonies. This statement, the decision to discontinue UFO investigations, was based on an evaluation of a report prepared by the University of Colorado in 1969. I believe this was the infamous Condon Committee study. There is substantial evidence to show that study was superficial and biased. In particular, the Echo and Oscar incidents I spoke about were never investigated by the Condon Committee, even though their principal investigator was well aware of these incidents. Obviously, the testimony given here today conflicts directly with that Air Force policy statement. We ask that our government answer to the public about the obvious discrepancy between our testimony and that of the current statement. Indeed, we demand an answer based on the foundation of our democracy that says, and I want to paraphrase Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, the people should be strong enough and well enough informed to maintain the sovereign control over its government. Finally, I want to say, I think I speak for every one of us here, I have the utmost respect for all the men and women in the U.S. Air Force. I graduated from the Air Force Academy. I thoroughly enjoyed being a part of the Air Force, and I was honored to serve my country in that way. Our disagreement and challenge to the Air Force has nothing to do with the people of the Air Force. It has to do with official Air Force policy. And I think they are deliberately withholding the facts, not just in what you've heard here, but continuously since 1969. And by doing so, they're not allowing the people of this country to engage in the decisions regarding events that are clearly national security issues and concern to all of us. We're simply asking for the truth. Thank you for your attention. At this time, we're going to take questions. Mr. Hastings will take it from here. If you would go to the microphone over here and tell us what media you represent. Thank you.
When you ask a question, I would ask first that you identify yourself and your organization, and then direct your question perhaps to a specific individual. That person will have to find his way to the mic, so there will be a bit of delay. Yes.
Pat McCune, the Daily Trojan, University of Southern California. We just did a big event here. And LucasArts, Mr. George Lucas himself. I wanted to commend all of you. You guys are soft-spoken, but you carry a big stick, and that's exactly the way to approach this issue. I remember when UFOs first got going, it was like a laughing matter until they started revealing themselves in the deserts, Arizona, Colorado, and so forth and so on. I'm standing up here not only because if I'm a resource to anybody, if LucasArts is, please let me know, and I'm glad to do whatever I can to help you. As well, I wanted to point out that my friend Charles Stone back here is something of a real authority on UFOs. He does quite extensive work on websites and all, and is a real authority if you need some questions answered. That's it.
Hello, Jeff Schogel with Stars and Stripes. Two quick questions. Mr. Hastings, you had mentioned that this is an ongoing phenomenon. Is there an incident later than 1980 that you are aware of? And then also, are there any testimonies here today that are new that have not yet been documented or been in the public domain?
This is a cross-section of the witnesses who've come forward. The latest incident involving nuclear missiles was at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 2007. However, the person is still active duty Air Force. I'm not going to elaborate on that until that person is separated from the Air Force. Another incident occurred at the Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, Area 2 weapons storage area. A series of incidents, the latest being in April of 2003, in which there were unidentified aerial objects maneuvering near the weapons bunkers at that facility. More recently, civilian sighting reports in Orange County, California, at the Seal Beach Naval Weapons Station, a series of bunkers, again, containing nuclear weapons. There were local media reports of multiple sightings in March of 2009 near this weapons storage facility. This is ongoing. This is the tip of the iceberg. We can only catch as catch can. I am of the opinion that for every incident that I'm aware of, and for witnesses that we've got in hand, there could be 10, there could be 100, there could be many, many more incidents that I'll never know about because the people won't come forward. They'll wait years or decades to talk about what they know.
And is anything that has been said here not been in the public domain before?
I'm sorry?
Anything that has been said here, I know I've heard the incident that Mr. Holt referred to, I've seen Mr. Salas. Is there anything here?
The other people that you've heard here today, I reckon you have not heard about. The testimony of the majority of these people have not hit the national airwaves, so to speak, or the national media. There have been websites, I've written articles and so on, but the majority of these witnesses have not received national or international exposure. I think if we could maybe limit one question per person so we can get everybody accommodated. Yes.
Gentlemen, Stephen Smith, KSHE Radio, St. Louis. I commend you all for being here. What an incredible panel. And Robert, you and I have always spoken over the phone. I'm still editing the book. I was at Naval Headquarters in Communications during the Carter administration. And I can affirm what you're all saying. This phenomena is incredibly real. And one day, a gentleman came into our comm station, came up to me, I had never seen him before in my life, and said, "Do you know that we have aliens on ice?" And I was just taken back and speechless. I didn't pursue with any questioning. And he turned around and walked away and walked out. I have been a contactee twice in my life, both times in Santa Monica, California, one in 1986, one in 1997. Incredible experiences that I won't go into detail right now. But I just want to say, bravo, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Spencer Ackerman with Wired. Mr. Hastings, could you elaborate on why you've speculated that the unidentified flying objects that all of you have described possess the agenda of trying to tell us to turn away from our path of use of nuclear weapons? Are there other potential explanations that you've considered and found less plausible? Is there a possible offensive threat to the world from these UFOs?
As I said in my introductory remarks, that's speculative on my part. However, given the available evidence, that is a plausible scenario. We can clearly say, based on radar data, which are empirical, not anecdotal, that these objects have been tracked since the early 1950s, if not earlier, traveling up to 7,000 miles per hour, making right-angle turns at high rates of speed, instantaneously hovering, reversing course. If we or the Russians or any country on Earth had those kinds of craft in the early 50s, why have we spent the last several decades developing fixed-wing aircraft of far inferior abilities? These are clearly, in my view, a technology from somewhere else piloted by beings from obviously another world or another dimension. Moreover, the fact that missiles have been tampered with here and in the former Soviet Union, and on one occasion in each country about which I am aware actually activated, I think we can rule out that these are the Americans attempting to start World War III or the Russians attempting to start World War III. Again, the technology involved is so superior, and we cannot conceive of a logical scenario whereby either of our countries would attempt to activate nuclear missiles for any reason under the sun. Now, our opinion is that whoever these beings are, they are indeed attempting to send a signal that we are playing with fire, that we are gambling with the human race's future. There are other possible scenarios. I have half-jokingly said from time to time, maybe they're planning to invade Earth and they don't want to inherit a radioactive environment when they do. Now, I don't believe that's what's going on by any means. I don't think humankind is in jeopardy from whoever they are and what their intentions are, except we will have our minds expanded. There will be a paradigm shift. Traditional institutions such as religions, governments, other social institutions may indeed be threatened by what is coming. That is just a logical consequence of what is about to occur. But if indeed this Earth is being visited by other races, and if those races are, one or more races, are in fact repeatedly monitoring and sometimes tampering with our nuclear weapons, that secret, in our view, should not be kept from the citizens of this planet any longer.
But you don't think there's an offensive element to their contact?
I don't think there's any potential hostility, except, again, to closed-minded people. Sure.
This is to the question of hostility. What you've heard up here, and especially in my case, they could have done a lot more damage, in permanent damage to our weapon systems, and they didn't. All of these weapons, in my case, were brought back up on alert. It took a day or so, but everything was fine. If they wanted to destroy them with all the powers they seem to have, I think they could have done that job. So I personally don't think this was a hostile intent.
Hi, I'm Charles Stone with the Tiger News Service. I didn't ask my friend to come up and make that statement for me, but appreciate your patience. I've published internationally in the history of weapons of mass destruction, including going back to the 1940s, and these incidents go back to at least that period of time, that U.S. government military facilities that were doing high-tech development in that period of time also reportedly at least had UFO visitors of various types. And that there is archaeological evidence that there have been what we would call that there's evidence of what was almost certainly atomic warfare in ancient history, at least twice. And also that I'd like to mention that one of our biggest and most powerful government agencies was founded in part to monitor UFO activities. That was the National Security Agency in the late 1940s.
Did you have a question, sir?
Are you aware that the NSA was partially founded to monitor UFOs?
I've heard rumors to that effect, and also the Central Intelligence Agency. In my view, those rumors aren't supported by any authoritative documentation at this point. I would not be surprised at the same time if that were ultimately proved true by historians, but that's as far as I think we can take it at this point.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is John Kelly. I'm a columnist at the Washington Post. Colonel Halt, you mentioned that when you went out you had a cassette recorder, a Geiger counter. You said a camera?
Camera, 35 millimeter camera.
First of all, did you take any photographs? And second, how does a cassette tape made by you, presumably for official purposes, end up at a cocktail party entertaining guests?
Okay, two questions. Let me answer the first one. The disaster preparedness individual I took along, Tech Sergeant Monroe Nevels, also worked for the base newspaper part-time. He was a professional photographer on the side, had a degree in photography, had his own darkroom. In fact, when he left the base, we had serious problems because he painted one of his rooms with flat black paint. We had to redo the paint about 4 or 5 times. He took numerous pictures of the indentations, pictures of the broken branches. He tried to take pictures of the objects in the sky. He took the film back home, and it all came out fogged. Unfortunately. Now, he did it in his own darkroom. I used to have a darkroom and dabble in photography, too. He could have done it himself. It could have been a radiation, which I have doubts about, or something could have happened that we don't know about. But anyhow, the film all came out fogged. Sergeant Pennison had a camera. It was not uncommon for the security police on the perimeter to carry cameras because the British have a lot of, we call them bird watchers, people that catch tail numbers and follow the history of airplanes and climb over the fence from time to time, not to do any damage or any harm, but curiosity and try and get close. It's part of a game. So we would, if they did that, we would photograph them inside the fence and turn them over to the British police. Sergeant Pennison took his film to the photo lab and turned it in, and they told him it disappeared. I can't answer that. The other question, what was the other question you asked about the...
So did you personally have a camera that were taking pictures?
I did not. I had the micro cassette recorder. We keep in mind we were just in the process of transitioning to word processors in those days, still using the typewriter. Our secretaries were very resistant to getting involved in modern technology. And so what I would do, I carried one in my pocket, a little linear, and we had the big linear machine in the office, and when I went around the base, I'd note, you know, the fence is damaged here, this needs to be painted, whatever was going on. And I'd come back and give her the tape, and she'd type it up for the staff meeting the following week. So I just thought, well, I'll take the tape recorder along because I don't want to take notes. It's cold and windy, dark. So I took my tape recorder along. It was a little micro cassette one, little tiny ones. I still have it, by the way. I came back, and after the tape was played at 3rd Air Force, and I played it for Squadron Leader Moreland and several other people, Ted Conrad, my boss, said, make me a copy. So I made him a copy. He put it in the desk drawer, in his desk drawer. He moved on and was replaced. And the gentleman that replaced him thought it was hilarious to play the tape. I didn't know this at the time at cocktail parties. So he was playing a copy. A copy of that copy somehow or other got to a gentleman by the name of Harry Harris, a British barrister or a lawyer. Harry was an amateur ufologist. He and a guy by the name of Mike Sachs. I traced this down years later. And a couple of ladies named Brenda Butler, Dot Street, and Jenny Randalls, who were writing a book at that time, all got involved, and my tape got out into the public domain, a copy of my tape. What's on the internet now is probably a 5th, 6th, or 7th generation, but it's out there. So does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Let me interject that Robert Jameson, the missile targeting officer from Malmstrom in 67, does need to catch a plane, and so if anyone wants to direct a question to him, you'll need to do it in the near term here.
Hi, Ledge King with Gannett, Washington Bureau. I have 3 questions, 2 of which can be answered by raising a hand. The first is, have any of you been contacted in the last month, I guess, whenever this event was being planned, by a government official telling you not to show up or trying to dissuade you? Any of them? Any of you? No. Second question is, Mr. Hastings alludes to the fact that there's a message being sent here that we ought to get rid of nukes. how many of you subscribe to that theory? The theory that you support getting rid of nukes, first of all.
I don't think he said that.
Well, that
What you're being asked is, Bob and I are of the opinion that the bottom line is the best explanation for what has taken place at our nuclear weapon sites is that whoever are in the UFOs are in effect sending a message, perhaps getting rid of nukes, expressing displeasure or concern, but certainly indicating an interference with the weapons. You're being asked whether you subscribe to that or not.
Do you support?
Not quite to that degree. I think they're modernists to make sure we don't mess things up.
Do all of you support getting rid of nuclear weapons? Show of hands. One. Okay.
Can I just add?
Sure.
With regard to the reason I came to the conclusion that this was a message was simply, again, they could have done a lot more destruction, I think, to our weapon systems, and they didn't. It was simply shining a light on our nuclear weapons, and literally shining a light on nuclear facilities. This has happened all over the world. I can point to other instances where UFOs came over, shone a beam down on the weapons storage area where nukes were stored. To me, it's pretty clear. This is just, we're shining a light on this. We're pointing it out. What are you people doing with nuclear weapons?
And my final question, which does require somebody to speak, is, you've talked about how society and the mainstream media sort of are very dismissive of all this. Can one or two of you talk about sort of the personal journey you've come to in terms of, approaching family or friends or others about this when people may think it's kooky to talk about this? Can one or two of you talk about how was it difficult? How difficult was it? That sort of thing. Thank you.
Well, as a person who is very, very skeptical about this, what I call UFO nonsense, when that happened that night and I thought through the process of what the logical explanations are, after that I was very careful about who I told what, because some of my friends, when I started on this, just laughed. So I got ridiculed. I was used to the ridicule from the Air Force, except for the dual standard. We're going to ridicule, but it's secret and don't talk about. And coming out was my. I came out a little bit. I talked to Robert. I gave him a little bit of the story. I didn't want my name to come out. I was concerned. I don't want to be considered a kook. I don't want to, because I consider. Not so many anymore, but I consider some of the extremists a bit kooky. But I think it's more important that we come out and tell our story rationally and see that we aren't kooks, and this is what happened, and make your own judgment. But one of my concerns is that you all think I'm a kook, and I'm old enough that I don't really care that much because it happened. So is that okay?
How old are you?
68. Going on 95.
I would briefly add to that I made a decision decades ago that no matter who laughed at me or threw things at me, I would speak what I knew to be the facts. The world is filled with self-appointed UFO experts, persons who have all the answers, even though they've studied none of the facts. The scientific community is chock full of those folks. Journalism, frankly, is chock full of those folks. We're presenting credible witnesses for open minds, people who have an objective sense of their duty to inform the American public about the reality of the situation. We're providing you not only these witnesses, but many other witnesses who can testify as to the reality of all of this, and you may draw your own conclusions.
I'm Lisa Fan from Epoch Times newspaper. My question is towards Mr. Arneson. You mentioned someone over there trying to send us a message. I wonder what kind of a message. Do those aliens consider our Earth people have a threat to them, or they just try to defend, or they try to come here to occupy, take over Earth? What kind of message do you think?
If I knew that answer, I wouldn't be here. I really don't know. But they're trying to tell us something without a question. Whether it's don't go much further, you get rid of the things, I don't have any idea. Are they from the extraterrestrial? Who knows? Are they from other dimensions? Who knows? Are they from underneath the earth? Who knows? Your guess is as good as mine, and I can't answer that question. Anything else?
The government are trying to conceal this information, the fact actually, for all those years. Do you think this will do good for the society's stability, or is it kind of prevent for some advance or further research for our society?
No, that's a big one. We have been lied to for so many decades about the truth of the matter, and I think we need to have more openness in society as far as what these things are. Recently, in the last year or two, the Catholic Church has said publicly, you know, hey, it's okay, ETs can exist. They're our brothers, and they are theologically saying it's okay to believe in extraterrestrials. And if the Catholic Church says it, it's got to have a big stick, I would think, as far as the Western world is concerned anyhow.
Do you think right now it's a time for human beings to admit there are other spiritual beings in the universe besides the human race?
Oh yeah, I think that's the thing is, people are so wrapped up nowadays in their own world. They're worried about jobs, they're worried about mortgages. They could care less about UFOs and ETs and paranormal events and whatnot. That isn't even on their radar scope. Unfortunately, but that's... I understand that. I haven't spoken to college students that much myself, but I understand that that is a fact. Yeah. And that's healthy. I think that's goodness. Oh yeah. I just wonder what's in the archives in the Vatican as far as UFOs and things like that are concerned. If that could be released, wow, I bet it would blow the socks off a lot of people. That'd be interesting.
Okay. Let me. You asked what would the potential changes be for society? Would this be good? Let me briefly summarize and say, in 1975, a former CIA official, Victor Marchetti, wrote a best-selling book called The CIA and Cult of Intelligence. The CIA took him to the Supreme Court to attempt block publication of that book. Ultimately, a redacted version of it was released. It was the first book in American history to be censored by the U.S. government. The same Victor Marchetti, in 1979, wrote an article for Second Look magazine. The title, I believe, was How the CIA Views the UFO Phenomenon. He said, among other things, this subject was so sensitive that you did not talk about it in the agency unless you had a need to. Nevertheless, there were rumors floating around at the highest levels of CIA about recovered crashed UFOs and the bodies of their crews. Thirdly, Victor Marchetti said, in his opinion, as an intelligence analyst with CIA for I think 11 years, he was of the opinion that no government on earth will voluntarily release this information because it would jeopardize the status quo, i.e. their power. Even if there's no hostile intent or implication to the visitation of these beings, if indeed these are extraterrestrials, even if they're not meaning us any harm whatsoever, governments have nothing to gain and everything to lose by admitting the reality of this. And Victor Marchetti's opinion is that this will probably come out, you know, by some action on the part of the phenomenon itself, which will leave no doubt in anyone's mind. But don't expect Washington or Moscow or any other government to volunteer the reality of all of this.
Thank you.
I'm Jim Canan. I'm a defense writer of long standing in this town for Gannett Newspapers, Business Week magazine, and I was senior editor of Air Force magazine. I'm going to ask a question, but I want to contribute something. When I was on Air Force Magazine, I was told by an Air Force colonel of long acquaintance that this was real and that we were actually dealing with the aliens. I never had the guts to write. He said, you won't have the guts to write this. I said, no, because I have to confirm it. And if you can't tell me how to confirm it, he did give me a couple names, but it didn't pan out. I was like all the rest of the press, you know, if I couldn't confirm it, I wouldn't write it. Now, that may mean that we're somewhat cowardly, but at the same time, it means that we're also very careful. I do sympathize with the members of the press who do not write about this, even though I myself am convinced of it by now, because I was one of them once. But now, I have a question contemporary. 2 years ago, the Air Force Chief of Staff and the Secretary of the Air Force were dismissed by the Secretary of Defense for, among other reasons, being sloppy in their management of nuclear weapons. We transported an armed one somewhere, we sent components overseas and so forth. This shook up the Air Force. I want to ask you gentlemen, in the aggregate or individually, do you think that this evidence of malfeasance ranks up there with not telling the public about alien or UFO intrusion at nuclear sites? Is there an equation there?
I don't know about ranking, but it points out the dangers of nuclear weapons. The fact that these accidents have occurred, serious accidents with nuclear weapons, and it just points out how dangerous it is that we have them. I don't know how to compare that with the cover-up. I'd have done an analysis of the cover-up, and I'd be glad to give it to any of you guys that are interested. But I think it's related in the fact that the cover-up of the fact that the UFOs did intercede with our nuclear weapons is extremely important.
May I add something? This Air Force colonel who talked to me about all this, he did so in result to my questioning about it after a Japan Airlines freighter over Alaska was trailed by a UFO in 1987. I called all over Elmendorf, FAA, the Pentagon. And then I was approached by this colonel whom I had known, who said, I understand you are interested in UFOs. And I said, yeah, you know, well, I have something to tell you. And since he had known me a long time, that's why he got into this. It had no great enterprise on my part, and I still don't know what to believe. But would you comment on, he also said, though, that we have a lot of misconceptions about what they are here for. He said they basically don't give a damn. They don't care what we do. They're here for their own purposes. And that any notion that they should land and say, take us to your leader, boggles the imagination, because they don't care about that kind of thing. And I said, well, do you have any idea why they are here? He said no. And he didn't think anybody else in the Air Force or anywhere else did either. How does that square?
Let me interject regarding the November 87 radar tracking incident that you alluded to.
Right, and
in recent years, you may know that the number 5 guy in the echelon at FAA, John Callahan, has gone public and said that shortly after that happened, CIA agent, 2 agents, I believe, and some other government types convened a meeting at FAA headquarters and said we want all the radar tapes, all the voice tapes, and this never happened. I wasn't here. John Callahan said, how come we can't tell the people about this? According to this FAA administrator, the CIA agent said the people would panic, the public would panic. John Callahan, to his immense credit, kept some of the data down in his office. The CIA agent said, give me all of this. He gave him everything that was on the table, didn't tell him about what was downstairs. And when he left the agency, John Callahan released that to the public. So CIA is still quite involved in all of this.
Leslie Kane's great book includes that again.
I think regarding well, to follow up on the other part of your question about, what are they up to, why are they here, and so on. No one knows. Maybe the people at the CIA and the Pentagon and the Kremlin don't even know. However, these very simplistic scenarios of if they're real and they're here, why don't they land on the White House lawn? Well, if they're anthropologists and this is a classroom experiment, you don't interject yourself into the experiment, you observe. Or an alternate scenario, if this backwards planet is on the verge of a nuclear holocaust, maybe on a limited basis you intervene in a way that the Pentagon knows what's going on, the Kremlin knows what's going on, except for troublemakers like us, the public at large in neither country does not know what's going on. So in effect, you send a signal, in my opinion, to governments about nuclear weapons without alarming the general populace. The late Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who was a UFO skeptic, he worked for Project Blue Book for so many years, he eventually believed, I've been wrong, science has been wrong, these are real, and we should check into it. When asked why, the aliens, if that's who they are, do not visit us, he said, a zoo is a nice place to visit, but you don't communicate with the lizards. So, there's any number of plausible scenarios to explain why we have not had open contact. I am of the opinion that whoever they are have enough sense to know that if they interject themselves into our reality in one fell swoop, there could be very dire repercussions. Whereas, on the other hand, if they engage in an on-again, off-again cat and mouse behavior that allows a slow psychological conditioning of humankind to the reality and the presence of themselves, then when open contact, if that indeed is in the cards, occurs, there will be far less trauma.
Thank you. I wasn't meaning to contest your point of view, by the way, merely pointing out what I had heard.
It's all right.
Michael Rank from Lancaster County. Al and I came down this afternoon and we were talking about the fact that we are now able to combine human and non-human genetic materials by our medical sciences. And I don't know whether any of you have had a chance to read Professor Jacobs' book, The Threat. He's a tenured professor at Temple University, and he has been doing regression therapy with abductees for years, and he has quite a body of knowledge there. One of my reasons for asking this is, being an old district attorney, the definition of murder is the unlawful killing of another human being, but nowhere does it say, does it have to be 100% human? Can it be 1% human? I'm waiting for somebody to play that card. I'm out of the business now, but that might be fun. The other issue is the toadies in government who are following their orders to lose the files in Freedom of Information Acts, I think might take a totally different view as to their attempt to preserve their jobs if they realize that there might be an argument made that there's a First Amendment violation by suppressing the truth about these things that have been found and seen and so forth. The suppression works to favor certain religions versus other religions. Thank you.
Anyone else? Thank you for coming. Again, all of us will be available for one-on-one interviews for some period of time. Thank you.
If you would like to support our channel, please purchase our new revised edition of Anunnaki vs. Pleiadian Gods with an added extra 12,000 words and many more images. Please find the link below. Thank you for the support. Today we're going to be speaking about the ancient city of Dwarka. This legendary ancient city is said to have been founded by Sri Krishna and is considered an extremely important historical landmark in the Mahabharata. Dwarka is considered one of the 4 sacred pilgrimage sites of Hinduism. The ancient city is mentioned in a number of ancient texts, including the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, the Harivamsha, as well as the Skanda Purana and the Vishnu Purana. Ancient Sanskrit literature explains how Lord Krishna, the 8th avatar of Vishnu, created the legendary city. The kingdom, suggests Hindu mythology, was constantly attacked 17 times in total. The city was extremely well protected and could only be reached by boat. The city was also extremely well planned, divided into 6 sectors, which in turn divided into residential commercial areas. The city was home to beautiful large roads, incredible decorated plazas, gardens and artificial lakes, and more than 800 palaces made of gold and precious stones. The legendary city of Dwarka is also the place where a mighty aerial battle took place. If we take a look at what ancient Hindu texts tell us, a king named Salwa attacked Lord Krishna in the legendary city of Dwarka. The description of the event are extremely interesting, and ancient astronaut theories suggest the descriptions of the battle hint at the possibility that some sort of advanced technology was used, even possibly flying crafts or spacecraft. Lord Krishna struck Salva with 16 arrows, and with showers of arrows he overpowered the airplane, just as the sun in a clear sky overpowers the whole sky by an ultimate number of molecules of sunshine. According to the epic Sanskrit text, in possession of his aerial vehicle, Salwa attacked the city of Dwarka, raining down mighty weapons that resemble lightning. According to the narration in the epic, he possessed an aircraft known as a Vimya and used it for air travel and for aerial warfare. Large parts of the city were destroyed in the attack until the god Krishna responded by firing weapons at this spacecraft. The weapons in the ancient text are described as arrows, but not ordinary arrows. It is said that once fired, the arrows roared like thunder and resembled bolts of lightning or rays of the sun. Also, the legend says that Krishna eventually departed Earth, and the ocean consumed his city of Dwarka. Up until a few decades, the city of Dwarka was thought to exist only in mythology. However, now that experts have actually discovered evidence of such a city existing near modern-day Dwarka, history changes, and with it the understanding and interpretation of ancient texts such as the Mahabharata. Underwater archaeologists have recovered a number of ancient artifacts in the Gulf of Cambay, including construction material, pottery, sections of walls, beads, sculptures and human bones, all which have been found to be at least 9,500 years old. The vast city, which is 5 miles long and 2 miles wide, is believed to predate the oldest known remains in the subcontinent by more than 5,000 years. The site was discovered by chance last year by oceanographers from India's National Institute of Ocean Technology, who were conducting a survey of pollution. Experts believe that the area where the ancient city existed was submerged by melting ice caps and the end of the last ice age, some 10,000 years ago.
So let me give you a little background to help you. So a little over 2 years ago, I released The Illusion of Us, which was my, you could call it my grand jump into all of this. Yeah. And then, so I've spent the last 2.5 years writing and researching and putting together what is, The Illusion of Us is sort of like a large introduction to all this stuff. You know, extraterrestrials, gods, ancient civilizations, conspiracies, suppression. The Stage of Time is the one that I've been really working on to not only talk about, well, this is my opinion based on this, but actually back it up with, well, here's the cuneiform tablet from Mesopotamia that actually directly talks about it. And then other evidence like geologic evidence of these cataclysms during the last ice age, which was known as the Younger Dryas, that destroyed all these civilizations. So this book is gonna break down all of that, and it comes out, and I'm releasing it this summer.
we've got a great guest called Matthew LeCoy. You've all probably seen him before on many of the big channels on YouTube. I mean, I scratched the surface on a lot of these subjects about the Anunnaki, but you actually dig really deep, and you go right. You probably know more than anyone I've come across on YouTube or any expert. So it's honestly it's a big honour to have you here. I really look forward to this interview.
I don't know if that's true, but I think we both have a good channel. So thanks Andrew for having me on. I appreciate it. We're located across the pond, right across the Atlantic right now. Yeah. You're in England. I'm in the United States in Maine. And we're gonna sit down and have a nice chat about what's real and maybe what's not real, and what's going on in our reality and what's going on in our solar system and galaxy, and what's the truth between all these lies and all these deceptions that have been taught to us, and these doctrines that we've been made to believe. So we're gonna try to separate what's real and what's not. And thanks for that nice intro, Andrew. I have a website, The Stage of Time, that you can find release dates for the latest work that I'm working on. Some of the ancient texts that I discuss and talk about, if you want to see directly things like the Atrahasis and read about a lot of the things that occurred in ancient history, you can find those links directly there. And I've been really working pretty hard in between doing some videos when I can, because I know how important that still is. But I've been working really hard to release my latest book called The Stage of Time, which is going to be a reflection of basically all my work, but more so it's also going to be like an ancient reference guide that I don't believe has been done yet, where you have a compilation of, well, here you have ancient text translations from cuneiform tablets and ancient Gnostic stories that include everything from the Atrahasis and the Code of Hammurabi, all the way up through Gnostic writings like the Nag Hammadi scriptures and Book of Enoch. It's gonna have an extensive list of all of these ancient texts, these ancient writings that talk about directly what happened long ago in our past, and gives the clues to weed out what the truth is with some of the misinformation that we've had.
The Code of Hammurabi, that was come across in my research, and that's interesting.
The Code of Hammurabi is one of my favorites. It actually is going to lead to directly tie into when we're going to talk about one of the tablets we're going to discuss called the Era Epic. And there's actually some correlation you'll see in those two that we'll go over. But basically, the Code of Hammurabi is really interesting because people want to know, well, how did things become the way they are? Where did laws come from? Where did the structure to everything come from? Was it just a bunch of people over time developed it, and then here we are, and it's all part of this natural cycle that just occurs? Or is there a lot more to it? And when you read the Code of Hammurabi, you really get an understanding of that. So what the Code of Hammurabi is, it's actually the largest cuneiform writing tablet in the world. It's a massive, tall, single stone that they carved all of this writing into. And it basically, Hammurabi was one of the later kings of Babylon. So Babylon was one of these empires in Mesopotamia that was constantly fighting with its neighbor, Nineveh, to the north. And they both had different gods and deities that were represented by them. So Babylon's god was Marduk, and we're going to talk a lot about that. But essentially, what Hammurabi talks about is how he was given divine rulership by some of these names we're going to go over, some of these beings that have identified themselves as gods. He distinctly says that they picked him, Hammurabi, to be this shepherder of mankind, and following through, handing down all these different laws and rules that he would use to govern the people. And so when we read all about those, we see where this entire structure came from, and we can see that it's by no means an accident. And the entire fabric of our society, when you look at how things are organized, what people believe in, what they're focused on doing, and what they're governed by, we can trace it back to the very beginning, because that really brings up the big question is, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing right now?
Am I right to believe it's something to do with Christianity? Has it got the Ten Commandments on it or something like that? And it was 500 years before Christianity.
It's similar in that it's this code that's handed down. It's called the Code of Hammurabi because it's essentially this long list of rules and laws that he was supposed to then use to govern. Now, what makes it interesting is those same laws and rules you also find in other tablets that were much earlier, something like the Instructions of Shuruppak, where you had Ubaratutu, who was a king there, also according to the Sumerian king list that echoes it, talks about how they had to lay down all of the laws and rules, these moral codes, to be continued by the next king, which his son was known as Zayasuja or Adrahasis, which we're going to go through a bunch of things as well about. But essentially that means is that these kings, these bloodline ruler ancestors that were chosen, and that's the word I really want to emphasize, these chosen bloodlines ancestors, they had to keep carrying down these rules and laws so that society would follow them very closely to keep order, to keep control and order within our society. And so if and we can jump right in, and we can go right into to one of those tablets that talks about that if you want me to jump right into that.
That's great. Yep.
So I wanted to go over some tablets that I've really never talked about. We're gonna do 2 readings today of tablets that I've never done a reading for or really talked about that much, because the bottom line is this: so many of the secrets of the past are found in these cuneiform tablets. That means these etched in writing of they essentially took clay and they heated it so that it would turn hard and last essentially for thousands and thousands of years. And by doing that, they could create this form of writing within the clay or sometimes rock that would essentially not erode ever or for a very, very long period of time, so that they could have a message be protected, a message that could be protected long into the future. And that's what these messages are, with the importance of what happened long ago, with what we can go over, which is basically the idea that there were these megalithic advanced human civilizations that once existed all around the planet. And today, all we have are these small remnants of those that are left. But more importantly, what we find is this continuation of building by their ancestors later that tried to accomplish what they did, but they weren't able to because they didn't have the understanding and the knowledge. And so essentially what we're about to read here in a second is that that knowledge and that information so that they knew how to do those types of buildings, how to create this type of kingship model so that they could structure society and create empires and great civilizations. How do you do that? Is that just something that, someone comes up with and is like, hey, this is a good idea how to do this? Or is it, more importantly, is it a very strict set of commands and rules that get relored over and over again? And that's what you see when you read things like the Sumerian king list and what we're about to read in a second. You see this over and over and over again. They have to keep lowering kingship into different civilizations because they're destroyed through things like war or cataclysms or whatever occurs, and they have to keep reestablishing this model on Earth. That's very important for them to have this certain model be followed here. So the tablet that I'm going to start with, that a lot of people might not have heard of, but I highly recommend it, is called the Epic of Eridu tablet. Okay, so Eridu was considered in Mesopotamia. And we're talking about a timeline that's, according to the Sumerian king list, is over 200,000 years ago. Okay, so we're throwing the timeline of human civilizations and what occurred on our planet, which we're going to go into and talk on a more wide scale basis. But we're going to go into where all that came from and what the real history of it all is. So the Epic of Eridu tablet talks about how the first city on Earth where kingship was lowered and civilization arose from. We're gonna read directly from that about how that came to be. The Epic of Eridu tablet. I'm going to read just a segment of it. You'll see if you read the Sumerian king list, it's strikingly similar. And it starts by saying, when the royal scepter was coming down from heaven, The august crown and the royal throne being already down from heaven, the king regularly performed to perfection the august divine services and offices, and laid the bricks of those cities in pure spots. They named by name in allotted half-bushel baskets. The firstling of the cities, Eridu, she gave to the leader Nunamud. The second, Bad Tabira, she gave to the prince and sacred one. The third, Larak, she gave to Palisog. The fourth, Sipar, she gave to the gallant Utu. The fifth, Sharupak, she gave to Ansud. On, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhur had the gods of heaven and earth swear by the names of On and Enlil. So when you read those names, those cities that I just mentioned, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sipar, Sharupak, all those terms are found in other tablets as well, talking about these cities that are almost not even there anymore. There's such a small amount that remains from this time period that if you were to go out in the desert of Iraq, down in the Fertile Crescent today, some of these remote areas that not many people go to, you can still find Eridu today. You could still find these remnants out in the desert in the sand of this massive complex that was just there, that all it's left now is just windswept sand over this, what looks like what was this huge, massive structure. And it's all that's left of Eridu. And of course, what we're talking about is a city that was built in kingship was descended down to more than 200,000 years ago. Okay. And that's going to be that's the theme of so much of this, is that we have to take our understanding of both which we're going to go into, the influences of those who came here, as well as the age of how far back human civilizations go. And what's amazing is we look around today at, the fact that we have we have cell phones and technology, TVs, and all this wireless and all these things around us. But yet, in many ways, we're less sophisticated than these global civilizations that used to exist are. Not in terms of technology like phones or something like that. This materialistic technology. Their technology was more of an understanding and a wise technology of understanding the electromagnetic grid of our entire earth, where all these ley line convergence zones were, to build these megalithic temples and these pyramids all around the world. They understood sophisticating building techniques for how to create these massive, perfectly symmetrical and precise walls in places like, if you go down to Tiwanaku and Machu Picchu and Cusco, we can see evidence of these civilizations that were once there that were then destroyed by cataclysms. And we're gonna read through some of these tablets that discuss some of those cataclysms that occurred. Okay, so let me explain something that I think has been rather lost in our modern society, and it's the hidden symbolism that existed long ago. These, just like we have today, certain words can mean more than one thing. And so if someone's trying to figure out what language and understanding that some other ancient civilization had from long ago, it's very, very easy to misinterpret what they were trying to say, because they often wrote and expressed themselves in a much, much more advanced, wise way than we do today. Unfortunately, they were far more intelligent than we are now, based on the fact that they had connections to information that was much more widely distributed until some of these disasters occurred. And then after this reset button occurred, which you can talk about, a lot of this became lost, but it didn't all become lost. And that's what the Druids represent, and what we're going to go into, is that there was information and knowledge that was still carried on by certain civilizations that were passed down to some of these practicing, you could call them pagan societies, that didn't follow modern Christianity or this monotheistic singular God aspect. Now, so that's where all this comes into play. Now, I want to give a little backstory before we jump back into St. Patrick and the Druids. It's going to tie into what we're going to talk about later on too. In the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, these ancient records from Atlantis that he wrote, essentially, right? And then he hid inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, which were then moved later on to Mexico. But what it says in those, he writes about how there were these beings that were pretending to be people, hiding amongst mankind in the shadows, and he called them serpent-headed when their glamour is lifted. Okay, and that representation, as well as there's an Iraqi artifact that looks like this reptilian, scary-looking alien type of thing from Iraq, but it's not actually a reptilian; it's a serpent. Again, a serpent is a reptile. So that's where this comes into play. Serpent-headed. What does that mean? Well, just like we're going to read later, they specifically mention how they called some of these ordainers of kingship, like Hammurabi, they were the shepherds of the black-headed people, right? Does that mean they're black? No, they're black-headed. Just like we see in all these depictions from Egypt of these bird heads and everything, it's what their mind, what was inside their head, what they were represented by. So what would black-headed be? It would be someone who's completely ignorant and has no knowledge. It's just black, it's empty. That's what those representations were. They were shepherds to the culture, the citizens who were essentially had no knowledge. There was no computers back then. They had no way of learning any of this stuff unless they somehow were royal or had connections to some of these libraries and access to a lot of this information. But back then, they had almost no information. We're talking about after some of these cataclysms. So when Hammurabi, he's part of the post-Diluvian civilizations of Babylon, he was talking about how he's shepherding all of these ignorant, unknowledgeable people, and he's their ruler. Now, getting back to what I said a minute ago in the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, serpent-headed, what does that mean? Well, it means wise and very knowledgeable. So just like you have a society where all these black-headed people, these ignorant people without knowledge are walking around, meanwhile, hidden among them are these what seem like people, but they're actually not really people. They're more like an incarnation of maybe another being that's very, very powerful and wise and has an understanding that none of the other people do. And maybe they even are just a person, but happen to be someone who's extremely knowledgeable and happens to have connections to the ancient ways to understand. So they would be called serpent-headed, because that would represent what their mentality was. And I know that's a hard thing for people to understand, because the serpent and the dragon have been this demonized evil thing all throughout, whereas the eagle has been this symbol of freedom and sovereignty, but it's completely the opposite. And you can see evidence for that all throughout history until this emergence of the Holy Roman Empire, when religion became very corrupted, and it was a lot of these terms, heaven, hell, the eagle, the serpent, they were all turned into their backwards meanings and inverted, and everything became all confused. And before we knew it, things like the symbol of the serpent and the dragon became associated with evil, when they actually represent knowledge, balance, and essentially creative higher consciousness. They are the fundamental principles that separates us essentially from being a barbaric, materialistic, warmongering type of person, because we're essentially humans. So like, what is our nature? Is our nature violent, or has that just been something that we've been conditioned for to become? Because when you truthfully look at it, the human race would, if it was left to its own means, would much more, with the right influences, would just as much turn into an enlightened, sophisticated civilization as they could also be conditioned into a warmongering, violent civilization. And that's what happened to us. So getting back to what I was originally talking about with the Druids and St. Patrick, the Druids represented one of the last societies on the planet that still practiced the ancient Egyptian and Gnostic wisdom, which connected all the way back to Atlantis, and the idea of understanding consciousness and the universe around you, and that the physical body is just an avatar for your consciousness and spirit. And so they were practicing all of that knowledge still. At the same time, the Romans were becoming extremely powerful and influential, the Holy Roman Empire. And St. Patrick's father was a Roman himself. So St. Patrick was tasked by the church, of course, the word saint should be used very loosely in this case. So St. Patrick was tasked to go to Ireland, Scotland, and England, and Wales, and rid all the serpents from that area. And of course, like you said, there's never been any snakes that live there. This is just a way to symbolically demonize them, even though that term is a term of endearment if you actually know what it really means. Serpent, it means wise and knowledgeable. So St. Patrick, we're celebrating, especially in the United States, everyone just gets drunk and thinks it's this wonderful holiday about Irish pride, but we're essentially celebrating the cleansing of an entire society where they exterminated large amounts of people, killed them, and then others they forced out to leave and go somewhere else. So that's what St. Patrick's Day represents. It's one of the last societies on the planet that still had connections to what was called the old religion. This knowledge of the ancient past that had become like a war on information over time, essentially.
If you actually speak to the Welsh, because that was a lot of Druid culture, and you ask them what happened, the Druids actually got their knowledge from someone underground. Now, King Arthur in the Welsh legend came from underground also. Like the Incas as well, they were supposed to come from underground to start the Inca.
That's right.
And
you want me to touch on the whole underground aspect? There are a lot of indications if you read. There's a lot of writings that talk about this extensive underground network that exists all throughout the world, but not like we think. I don't think the Earth is hollow, but I do think that they've cleared out very large areas and they've gone down and they exist in addition in non-physical forms in what's called the underworld. Okay, so when you mentioned the Inca, they have a story of Lake Titicaca about how Viracocha, their god, came out of Lake Titicaca and created them. And then just like you said, all around the world, there's all these stories about how beings came from, or knowledge came from under the ground and then came to them, and then they came to acquire all this.
Alexander the Great sealed Gog and Magog in a tunnel underground somewhere. Sounds like something underground's going on. And then you've got Agartha, you've got Hyperborea, you've got Ultima Thule, you've got all these descriptions of underground civilization.
The North and South Pole is very interesting, and the whole underground thing is connected to the idea where how would you be able to control something like the electromagnetic energy of our planet, or control where some of the idea of a pole shift occurring, or where the energy centers are. The North and South Pole, where a lot of this no-fly zone, strange things like when Admiral Byrd flew over the North Pole and then spoke about how there was a strange entrance that he saw, and then all that information that led to that suppression of that information. What essentially has been happening is there's a lot of things behind closed doors that society just never gets to see. Things down in Antarctica, things in the North Pole, connected all the way back to ancient technologies and some of these secret societies. We're basically living in a reality that if people knew the truth about some of these things, it would almost seem like something right out of science fiction. It's very, very bizarre, but essentially what it comes down to is there's a long, much older history than we realize here, with advanced civilization, or civilizations that came here long ago and imparted all of this knowledge that came from heaven down to earth. And of course, the term heaven and hell became a very confused term within religion, but really it breaks down to something like hell is equated to the underworld, where we're going to go over the idea that, well, what if beings are non-physical that exist in other dimensions? Would the underworld be a place of demons and where evil comes from? Or is there also more to the story than that? And that's what essentially we're going to come to, is that if this may help people understand, there's an obsession about balance here. It's always about balance, a balance of energy, as above, so below. That essentially explains everything. If you have and there is evil that exists in the lower dimensions that's down there, that is held back by some of those who protect it, they say. But if you do have that, then you also need benevolent forces down there, beings that can balance that. The same thing is true for the higher dimensions. You can have evil that exists there, but it also has to be balanced by good. So there's different beings that essentially were able to conquer these laws of reality, and were able to take on these different roles in these different places to manipulate reality, to create whatever reality they wanted to, and to also be able to control and harness energy, free energy, like Nikola Tesla figured out, which is essentially exactly the same thing about all these ancient pyramids all over the planet on these ley lines. It's always about energy, because energy is essentially what is the driving force behind everything. It's what continues something living without dying through entropy. Okay? And so what it comes down to is essentially these beings that came here long ago, they call themselves the Anuna, and they took over a lot of these roles within our reality and within religion, becoming essentially like angels and demons. But at the same time, there are other beings, other sentient beings that are in the universe as well, because we're talking about such a vast amount of space and planets and life that exists. It can't help but just create sentient life, because if you think about it, the intelligent design that's behind everything in the universe is a design that forces this combination of nature coming together with this intelligence that exists already, this conscious intelligence that exists everywhere, to create the environment where life just can't help but come to be. And that, I think that's the missing point that we need to look at all across the galaxy and the universe, is that there's likely probable life, especially when you look at things like the Drake equation. There's probable life all over the galaxy and universe. And there's the probability that sentient life was able to develop in those places means that even if with all the disasters and planetary things that can happen, there still would be hundreds, if not thousands, of advanced sentient civilizations that exist in our galaxy alone. And I know that sounds like something that would be impossible, but that's based on the mathematical probability when you take into account all of the different seeds and the different things that go into life, carbon and the amount of nitrogen and oxygen, all these things that can come into play. How abundant are those throughout their entire galaxy and universe? And truthfully, we may be this species that's been closed off from knowing the truth because we're so primitive and we're still developing at such a state that it would cause complete chaos if we learned the truth. Yeah, so if you go into and you read things like the Atrahasis, and you read things like the Enuma Elish, you see that there have been all these different experiments to create like a perfect being, a perfect human here. And it was all this trial and error, and what, according to all those tablets, that we were essentially created to be far more superior than we were supposed to be, in the image of the Anuna. That's what they call themselves, and we're supposed to look exactly like them, but yet fit for the place that we're in, smaller, because they don't come from here. That's why they don't fit living in a place like this, whereas we're designed specifically for Earth. We are a person that's based on the electromagnetic gravity of this planet. We're here, we're of the size that we should be, but that wasn't always the case. Like, this whole idea behind these fallen angels and this crossbreeding of Nephilim with all these giants that ruled as kings, these ancestral bloodline kings were much, much taller than we are now, and they lived for a much extended amount of time than we do. So we're this different stage of humans that's come from so many different groups in different epochs where things have happened, where we used to live for a very, very long time. We used to be much taller. And over time, there was even tampering and manipulation done because of how intelligent we were getting, how aware we were becoming. And it talks about how we were actually genetically downgraded, and these chakra centers inside us were unplugged so that we wouldn't be able to connect to our higher self. And we would be trapped in this internal state of lower energy so that we could essentially be controlled here.
So the only way to do it now is through taking psychedelics?
Well, you can do it in many different ways. Psychedelics are one way to do it, but another way you can do it is through connecting to the natural world and meditation and getting in tune with your higher state of energy. And you have to release all these toxins that are inside our body, cleanse the body and the mind, and then the rest will follow. And then you'll be able to essentially connect to this Trinity that it's always talked about in religion, connecting to this Father, Son, and eternal soul. What it really comes down to is this idea of where we have this physical body, we have this consciousness, and then there's this intelligence of the universe that is called God or the prime creator. So essentially this Trinity is the body becoming healthy to the point where it can reach an optimal state, the mind becoming cleansed and freed of all of its burdens to be clear, to reach a higher state, and then connecting to this higher consciousness intelligence of the universe. That's this Trinity, this connection of all three different types of energies that once they come together, we become this ascended being, like Gandhi or Buddha, all these different things, these beings who managed to ascend to a higher state. And that's the whole game here. That's the entire game here. Like back to the Druids, there was an organized attempt to rid all the knowledge of how we could reach that higher state, to keep us in a lower state permanently, to keep us in a lower state of energy, just to be used just as energetic slaves here. And essentially that's why our entire model of reality, after some of these disasters occurred, became so focused around control and war, because we entered in this time period when we were no longer being influenced by those who were trying to help us. We were actually being controlled by some of the more malevolent beings that we can go into.
We've talked about the Anukim, which I presume are the Anunnaki, what I call the Anunnaki.
Yeah, they call themselves the Anuna.
Right.
The Sumerians call them as a third person. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki, which meant those from Anu who sent from heaven to earth, or those from heaven to earth came, essentially. But they call themselves the Anuna. That's their actual name, and I believe that they're a combination of, like, when you look at something like the story of the Dogon with the Nomo, and how they talk so much about how they came from Sirius, and you look at the Nomo and the connections that the fish suit has back to Enki, and some of these beings that are part of this different time period of Pisces and represented through fresh water. You see that, oh, okay, well, that Oannes is Enki, okay. And that's the Nomo. That's the same thing. And what that connects back to, and also looking at the pyramids, how they're aligned to these different Sirius and Orion, it makes a lot of sense when you start thinking that however they got here, maybe it must have been through some kind of a wormhole or a Stargate, because I think linear travel from a place like Sirius or Orion would essentially be impossible. We're talking about distances that are so enormous that we have to get past a linear mindset and look more into, well, these are advanced beings that learned how to conquer reality itself, okay? And that is something that is mind-boggling to consider, is that, yes, they were once physical beings, but they realized how to conquer that. And we can go through tablets that actually directly talk about that too.
Just now, I'd like to go back to about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. Something major happened. It's described in the Amarna tablets. It's described in the Heibaru as they came and destroyed civilization. And
so that's an interesting comment or question, because it's rather complicated. It looks like, if you look into the records, especially something like the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, he talks about how during the time of Atlantis, before 10,000 years ago, there were, these global civilizations that were extremely advanced, advanced in terms of understanding energy and having pyramids and temples all around the world that had certain kind of rock that was quartz rich so that it could resonance with a high vibrational frequency, so they could reach these incredible states of consciousness. Because what I believe, based on what I've looked at, is that the Anuna originally were physical beings. That's why they have to have the Ajiji do, and we're going to read about that as we go on, have the Ajiji do all the physical labor for them. They're like demigods of them. But over time, they learned how to conquer the rules of reality, and then they became non-physical in terms of being able to be interdimensional. They could go between different dimensions and influence so many different aspects of our reality. But at the same time, the Ajiji remained essentially as watchers of our world. And I believe that they're the ones that are probably most connected to what we think of as UFOs. They're tasked as watching and monitoring everything that's going on here, because the Anunnaki actually became separated by time and how we view it. And so time for them became much different than us. So essentially Gigi's purpose is to watch us. So getting back to that, Atlantis was a place where these different temples were erected and they could actually communicate with these gods. That's essentially what these temples were. They were temples that were created and this massive energy grid all over the planet. They could essentially communicate with these beings, and they could reach the highest states of consciousness to become like almost like gods themselves. And it was all this bizarre stuff that we would consider science fiction today, where they actually learned alchemy. I call it alchemy magic, because it really is beyond what is called sleight of hand magic, and it really is like an aspect of manipulating the reality around you, and that became lost over time. But during the time of Atlantis, you had these high priests connecting to these gods, these beings, while at the same time practicing all of these ancient arts through dark and white magic. And what happened is you essentially had a corruption of Atlantis, where they used that power and their technology to essentially help create and further the destruction that occurred on the earth. So like you say, some of these wars that were occurring were very real, because when Atlantis was destroyed, what you had was this struggle for power after, okay? Atlantis was destroyed through a combination of their own, like I said, their own technology and manipulation, but along with some of these devastating events that were occurring on the earth at the time, which was around the last ice age. But after that happened, there was an attempt to restart a lot of these civilizations around the planet, while at the same time, great empires were rising up, because they were in a different zodiacal time period, and they were all fighting for control. At this time, you had all these gods fighting over control for who could be supreme. All of the rules had been essentially dissipated that had existed long ago with these global civilizations. And it was like anarchy, chaos on our planet for essentially like the last 7,000 years. It's been just complete war and anarchy on our planet. And that's why so much has been lost and destroyed, along with the disasters that caused it. So I think there was two things going on. There were actual physical wars being fought between the civilizations on the planet that were essentially being ruled through different gods for supremacy. They were all just fighting each other, okay? And that's one of the reasons why I think kingship also kept having to be moved, because I think some of these places were just completely destroyed or taken over, and then that kingship model, that control of governing was lost, so they had to re-lower it again, because they kept trying to create this perfect world. While at the same time, this control over our reality here, creating a false paradigm, keeping the human race enslaved in this lower vibrational energy through war. When you read about ancient people like the Hopi or the Maya, they talk about the Pleiadians. They talk about the Seven Sisters and how there were other beings that were involved as well in our timeline, trying to at the same time help humanity and break us out of this illusion here and help educate us and enlighten us. And they maybe even been involved with some of the seeding that occurred here long ago. But the point is, they were essentially in some ways in this war in heaven, this higher dimensional war with what the Anunnaki were doing to humanity, keeping us enslaved here essentially. And we can go over that as we go on, but essentially the war in heaven was this war of these different beings who kept fighting over wanting our future to go a certain way. And so as above, so below was represented in the physical realm of Earth with all of this war and chaos that was occurring here, with civilizations all fighting here, because it was like chaos in the heavens and the underworld. So it was reflected here on the planet, and that's still happening right now. That's why all this war has been going on. If you look at places like Libya, you can see some of this this glass that's been formed from some incredible amount of heat that occurred out there. And like you said, some of these ancient cuneiform stories talk about how there were these devastating wars. What does that mean? Could there have been ancient nuclear technology used? Very possibly. We don't even know the extent of how bad the destruction was, but you could see how if they were fighting and using, and there was advanced technologies that, you know, only came to be much later on, like some kind of a nuclear weapon, you could see how something like that could totally wipe out an entire city, and they would have to lower kingship again and restart over in another place. Because I do think that at that time, long ago, it was still complete chaos, and a lot of these things were happening. But later on, after the reset occurred, I think they took a much less of a role, and in many ways maybe even left. And so humanity sort of had these temporary rulers through these secret societies and elite families, who then perpetuated this same model of war and chaos right up until today. And I think that's why you see families like the Rothschilds that are so connected to these bizarre quotes, like saying, you know, if my sons didn't want war, there would simply be none. You know, quotes like that are so scary and bizarre, and they show us that all of these terrible events that are occurring here are actually manipulated and created to try to steer things in a certain direction or keep us in a certain state. So yeah, we have this long history of destruction that may go far beyond what we can even imagine, especially if you look at a place like Mars and, you know, another planet nearby where radioactive isotopes have been found all over the planet, like covering the entire planet. And there was this sudden massive event that occurred there where the entire atmosphere was blown out, and everything, and all the liquid water evaporated into space, and it destroyed this whole planet. Was that remnant of ancient nuclear weapons?
Like a lot of people say, they left at the end of the Cold War. What scares me, Matt, is we seem to, in the past, it would have been sci-fi to a lot of people trying to describe this. Now, we can understand it because a lot of the technology that was used in the past is used now. So
yeah, that's right.
We're getting very close to the part where they destroyed themselves.
Well, I think it's actually more. It's more complicated than that, because there's a lot of people and whistleblowers that have come out and said during things like the Cold War and during these really, really tense times when the United States or Russia or whatever location may have wanted to or even did try to launch nuclear weapons against the other country, and then something strange occurred where the button wouldn't work or became disconnected and there was no signal, and they literally couldn't launch these weapons of mass destruction that would have led to, you know, this drawn out war that could have, you know, cost billions of lives and been much more destructive than people realize. That's showing you that there are other forces involved here beyond what we see and what we know, who are trying to help guide us so we don't destroy ourselves and end up as another reset that has to start over again from the very beginning. And if we can get into that, I would like to read a tablet that talks about that destruction that occurred here and this reset that happened. Because essentially you had, when I mentioned, you had a situation where advanced technology was all over the planet, these global civilizations. There was these giants that were the ancestral remnants of the Anunnaki through crossbreeding that were like abominations on the earth. There was all this unbalance. And so what did they do? Well, they decided to just reset the entire human civilization and start over again. And that's why kingship was relowered, just like the Sumerian king list says, relowered again after this destructive event occurs. So what I want to read is a tablet called the Era Epic, okay? And Era is connected to this god named Nergal, who is a god of the underworld, who essentially allows chaos into our realm. He's the the guardian gatekeeper of that. And it's tablet 1 states, and again, you'll see a lot of these names that we've been talking about right in here. It says, the Anunnaki gods cannot fall asleep for the clamor of humankind. Beasts are overrunning the meadows, life of the land. And when it mentions clamor, it's talking about how we used to have this one language connecting all around the world, and that's why the Tower of Babel is this symbolic representation of when humanity was all divided and languages were all created and we all became a divided race rather than one unified race, okay? O king of all inhabited lands, creator of the world, holder of a sublime scepter, herdsman of the black-headed folk, shepherd of mankind. Lord Era, why have you plotted evil against the gods, to lay waste to the lands and decimate the people? Era made ready to speak and said to Isham, his vanguard, keep quiet, Isham. Listen to what I say as concerns the people of the inhabited world whom you would spare. O vanguard of the gods, wise Isham, whose counsel is always for the best. I am the king of the land. I am the fiercest among the gods. I am warrior among the Ajiji gods, mighty one among the Anuna. I will make Marduk angry, stir him from his dwelling, and lay waste to the people. The warrior Era set out for Babylon, city of the king of the gods. He entered Isalia, palace of heaven and earth, and stood before him. He made ready to speak, saying to the king of the gods, why has your precious image, symbol of your lordship, lost its brilliance? The king of the gods, Marduk, made ready to speak, saying to Era these words, O warrior Era, concerning that deed you said you would do. Once long ago, indeed, I grew angry. Indeed, I left my dwelling and caused the deluge. When I left my dwelling, the regulation of heaven and earth disintegrated. When Marduk heard this, he made ready to speak, saying to the warrior Era, when I rise from my dwelling, the regulation of heaven and earth will disintegrate. The waters will rise and sweep over the land. Bright day will turn to darkness. Whirlwind will rise, and the stars of heaven will be in chaos. Demons will raise up and seize the land. The gods of hell will rise up and smite down living creatures. Who will keep them at bay till I gird on my weaponry once more? When Era heard this, he made himself ready to speak, saying to noble Marduk, O noble Marduk, when you enter the house, fire cleanses your apparel, and you return to your palace. For that time I will govern and keep strong the regulation of heaven and earth. I will go up to heaven and issue instructions to the Ajiji gods. I will go down to the depths and keep the Anuna gods in order. So what that is essentially talking about is how they created this destruction on the planet to wipe away all of humanity, to then allow in this agreement so Marduk could rise to become this king of the Anunnaki here on earth, which was why Babylon grew to become such an important place in the world, because Marduk was their chief deity. Okay, and Babylon is a city that spans the pre-Diluvian and continues into the post-Diluvian. That means that Babylon itself is an ancient city that's far older than we know. And a lot of these cultures after the cataclysms had to come back in and rebuild them again, over and over again. In the Nag Hammadi scriptures, the chapter called the Hypothesis of the Archons, which means the rulers, it directly calls them the rulers of our reality, the rulers of the demiurge, meaning they understand that there's a primitive side of the human race that can be essentially perpetuated and controlled to keep us in a lower state. The demiurge represents our lower state, things like war, chaos, material greed, lust, all of these primitive urges that can be perpetuated to keep people in a lower state, because they'll never be able to reach a higher state, like we talked about, unlocking chakras and reaching higher states of consciousness, if they're being ruled by their demiurges of fear and war and chaos, and keeping them in this lower state. And that's the whole game here, Andrew. That's what they're essentially trying to do. It's like a farm of consciousness here to keep us in this chaotic state. That's why things like these symbols were manipulated, so that we wouldn't understand the truth about what they really represent. So I want to bring something up really important right now. When you look at these depictions, like we talked about, this headed aspect, serpent-headed, black-headed. Well, what about these depictions of these Anunnaki in murals all over the world where they have an eagle head, and they're passing along with a pineal gland in their hand with a handbasket? Well, let's go over what that means. Some of them had serpent heads, some of them had eagle heads, and what that essentially meant was, what kind of knowledge were they passing on? The eagle represents essentially the demiurge, war, control, and the material world. So you would essentially be teaching how to create these empires and civilizations based on certain kinds of laws to keep control. That's why they were represented through an eagle head. They were still passing along knowledge, creating powerful armies and controlled, organized civilizations. But at the same time, that's not a type of knowledge that can lead to balance, right? It's a type of knowledge that can lead to unbalance and keeping society in a place that doesn't allow them to reach a higher state, but more traps them in a state where they're always fighting. Like, look at the Roman Empire, just like modern day empires today, like we see with like the United States that I call the empire with the great eagle that's presented on it. They rule their societies through fear and through keeping them entertained, but not entertained in a way where they would learn something and better themselves. They kept them entertained through violence. It's a war on consciousness, and it's a war on which direction our civilization will go. That's why the eagle and serpent is this battle back and forth. You see so many depictions. Look at the flag of Mexico. It's this eagle holding the serpent. It represents this war of these two sides of, you could call it like almost like the yin and yang of our consciousness. It's the two sides of us. Which way will we go? Are we going to be, like I said, this having our demiurge control us and being controlled through war and conquering? Or are we going to become wise and knowledgeable and balanced and use our creative energy to try to increase our understanding of reality and become a sophisticated civilization? Those two sides were what was the war was about. That's what the war in heaven was essentially about, because there was different sides that wanted different things, and some of them, like Enki and Thoth, they wanted human civilizations to reach higher states of consciousness. Meanwhile, Enlil, Ninurta, Nergal, some of these other figures didn't want human consciousness to reach higher states, so they kept them in this perpetual state of anarchy, so that they would never allow to ascend. So essentially you get to places like the United States and all throughout the world, through the Roman Empire, through the Spanish empires, and all these countless empires that have emerged and been at war. They are essentially always get corrupted, this corrupting aspect, and then they often start as a pure place of wanting to be a place of free speech and teaching about wisdom, but they often get corrupted and become a tool for propaganda and evil and war. And that's what we're seeing today with places like the United States used to be founded on these great principles of our founding fathers, but then became corrupted and taken over through this military industrial complex and different influential families and beings that wanted to control how our future and reality goes. So we essentially have to start over and relearn a lot of this information so that we can understand what is real and what's not real. Okay. And so, so I want to talk about, Andrew, unless you had another question, I wanted to bring up another tablet that explains all of this essentially. Okay. And I've read it before, but I want to read this part again because it's very important. Okay. It's very important to understand how we ended up at where we are today. And that is the tablet 2 of the Atrahasis. It's probably my favorite piece of cuneiform text of all, because what it says is it gives us clues to really what happened and how all this ended up the way it was. And on tablet 2, part of it says, and I'm paraphrasing because I'm jumping in here because it's a very long tablet, but essentially it says, "Where you went, Enki, you were to undo the chain and set us free. You were in charge of control and holding the balance, but instead you gave wisdom and knowledge to the people. Your creations have become too numerous and despoiled the earth. You imposed your loads on man. You bestowed noise on mankind, language, intelligence, and knowledge. You slaughtered a god together with his intelligence. Let us make far-sighted Enki swear an oath to the end, to create a flood on earth to wipe away all of life." So that's an amazing thing, not only because they're talking about these cataclysms, which I want to talk about really briefly because it's very important, but it talks about this phrase, "undo the chain to set us free." All right, now think about that for a minute. If these are physical beings that came here, and they were physical at first, this chain represented them conquering the laws of reality to become non-physical, essentially losing this binding of having to be a physical being that dies and then has to incarnate over again. They essentially conquered those laws, and that's how they were able to conquer our reality. That's what that means. And they reset the entire civilization that was here because it become out of control. It become unbalanced and out of control. And so they wanted to create it over again. But the problem was, after they created civilization again, after this destruction occurred, which I was reading about in the Era Epic, after they had created it over again, it ended up becoming far more unbalanced and controlled than ever before. So what was supposed to be something that was benevolent and was supposed to be good to help the human race ended up being a means which forced us into even more control than ever before. And that's why we lost so much of what we used to have. And what I mean by lost, we're talking about these global civilizations that go from Easter Island up to the Inca of Peru and over in Tiahuanacan in Bolivia, right up through the Aztec and the Maya, up through the Americas, over to places like around the Mediterranean and in Baalbek, Lebanon, and right down through Egypt, along the Nile, and over into Mesopotamia, over into India, right up through Western Turkey, up into Western Russia. This is a massive part of our world who used to have ancient civilizations, like I said, well over 10,000 years ago, that existed all around the planet, that had completely different knowledge and understanding than we did, that were connected to these gods, that were these sages and priests would go to these temples and would connect to them and then would guide the people. So then what happened, like you said, things became extremely unbalanced. The people became very, very wise and knowledgeable, and they ended up using that to their advantage and became powerful, and things got haywire here. And that's what I was talking about with Atlantis. So essentially what they did is they allowed this, or even created this series of cataclysms to essentially wipe everything away and start over. And they were able to do that through the combination of what looks like allowing or timing this comet to hit the northern ice caps, because this was during the last ice age. At the same time, we had what looks like poles shifting and the electromagnetic grid of the Earth completely becoming disrupted. And so over the course of 800 to maybe more than 1,000 years, there were like these back-to-back disasters that occurred. It wasn't just one disaster. It would be a disaster like the comet hitting the ice caps and having them create a massive flood that led to the extinction of a lot of the megafauna in the Americas, like the woolly mammoth and the dire wolf.
And this is what David Wilcox talks about when he talks about looking at these ancient like rock formations where it looks like a massive flood has happened.
That's right. And so we had this episode where massive floods, things like enormous earthquakes and tsunamis that split open the earth in places and disrupted even some of the land masses. And at the same time, the climate was rapidly shifting, and you had these wildfires that were tearing apart around the globe. That's why when you go to places like Peru and you go to Egypt, you see this scarring and this burning on these monoliths, on these ancient carved stones, which were part of these building practices. You see this scarring that occurred from the combination of this destructive solar activity because the electromagnetic grid had been disrupted. So all this incoming solar radiation could just pummel the planet, creating wildfires, and the climate was shifting. So what happened? Like Graham Hancock talks about recently, he's done some new interviews that are pretty spot on, I agree with. If you have a sophisticated advanced civilization that becomes comfortable with its own technology like we are today, they lose sight of how to be this nomadic aspect where they can survive in the wild. Like we could never survive in the wild today. We don't have those skills anymore. So what happened? These cataclysms, or numerous cataclysms come through. These changes all around the world take place that are so violent that these sophisticated advanced human civilizations were wiped out. And there were remnants of them that are still around, but the majority of them are wiped out. And what you had left were at the same time these coexisting nomadic more indigenous people were on the planet, and they were the ones that had to then carry on the legacy. But they only had small connections to whoever had survived, and over time, each generation went by, these more primitive people who I believe who tried to rebuild things like Machu Picchu on top of these ancient structures. Even in places like the Maya and Aztec, you see that, but they just didn't have that information and knowledge. And so they started worshiping what they thought were these ancient gods from long ago, but they no longer had connections to them anymore. That's why they started becoming so focused and corrupted through blood sacrifice, and then identifying certain gods with things like the forces of nature and storms and things like that. So people see things like that and say, oh, this is a sun god or a storm god. Yeah. That's because over time, all of this information was being lost and confused, and they started just trying to worship everything that they thought were these gods, when in reality, some of them were just the forces of nature. Don't confuse those two things. They're interchanged. Whereas you see something like Enki is directly speaking to someone like Ziasudra Atrahasis, giving him direct commands. Clearly, that's not just some force of nature doing that, because he's giving him direct commands and information about things that were about to happen and how to survive. Okay, and that's what that story is all about. Mm-hmm. Is Atrahasis Ziasudra, he was called also. He was Noah, and he was essentially one of the only ones who survived some of these cataclysms because he was warned, because he was an ancient ancestor of Enki, and Enki wanted to protect that certain bloodline so it could continue long into the future. That's why we have so much confusion on this, on what's occurred here, because we have these different epics of humanity, these epics that have occurred, and the rise and fall of technologies. And after these happened, you had an attempt to reestablish them in places like Göbekli Tepe, but it was for nothing, because this time period featured multiple different time periods of destruction, and they were wiped out. So the reset occurred on multiple levels. And what we're left with today, to make a long story short, is what we're left with today are just these remnants and pieces that are left. That's it.